I was fired from my job the same day my cheating wife said, "You're just a mistake I made. I'm taking the kids." Crushed, I wandered into a diner just to clear my head. An old woman sat down next to me, studied my face, and said, "You look just like my son, but he's been missing for 35 years. Her next 5 words changed everything. You know how they say when it rains, it pours? Well, whoever came up with that little gem of wisdom clearly never had a day like mine, because what happened to me wasn't just rain. It was a freaking Category 5 hurricane with a personal vendetta. The morning started normal enough, which should have been my first red flag. I rolled out of bed at 5:30 a.m. like I had for the past 9 years, 8 months, and 16 days. Not that I was counting or anything. The alarm clock's obnoxious beeping cut through the silence of our suburban bedroom, and I could already hear Marissa's annoyed sigh from her side of the bed. She'd perfected that particular sound over the years, turning it into an art form that could communicate exactly how much my existence irritated her without her having to waste actual words on me. I shuffled to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. Same tired eyes, same 5 o'clock shadow that never quite looked intentional, same Marcus Sullivan staring back at me like he was wondering how the hell we'd ended up here. 34 years old and looking every damn day of it, plus interest. The drive to Millfield Manufacturing was the usual 23 minutes of mind-numbing monotony, past the McDonald's with the perpetually broken ice cream machine, through downtown where the historic district was just a fancy way of saying we can't afford to update anything, and finally into the industrial park that housed the factory where I'd been clocking in since George W. Bush was still figuring out how to be president. I should have known something was off when I walked through those glass doors and Jenny at reception wouldn't make eye contact. Jenny, who usually greeted everyone with the enthusiasm of a golden retriever on espresso, suddenly found her computer screen absolutely fascinating. The pit in my stomach started forming right then, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe she was just having a rough morning. Maybe her cat died. Maybe her favorite reality TV show got canceled. Anything but what I was starting to suspect. But paranoia, as it turns out, is just anxiety with better instincts. Mr. Peterson, or Pete the Prick, as we called him when he wasn't around, was waiting for me by my workstation. Pete was one of those middle management guys who wore cheap suits and expensive cologne, thinking one would make up for the other. He had the kind of mustache that made you wonder if he was trying to look distinguished or if he'd lost a bet. "Marcus," he said, and I knew immediately that I was screwed. Not Mark, like he usually called me, not even Sullivan, but my full first name with all the ceremony of a funeral director. "We need to talk in my office." The walk to his office felt like that final mile death row inmates take, except the fluorescent lighting was worse, and the company motivational posters were more depressing than any last meal. Teamwork, because sometimes you can't do it all yourself, stared down at me mockingly. "Yeah, thanks for the pep talk, corporate wisdom." Pete closed the door behind us, which was about as subtle as a brick through a window. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, the squeaky one that put you at a psychological disadvantage, positioned just low enough that you had to look up at him like he was some kind of discount deity. "Marcus, you've been with us for almost 10 years, he started, shuffling through papers that I'm pretty sure were just for show. "You're a reliable guy, always on time, rarely miss work." Here it comes, I thought. That was going to change everything. But the company's going through some restructuring. Corporate's making cuts, and unfortunately, your position has been eliminated. Eliminated. Not let go, not laid off, but eliminated. Like I was some kind of error in a spreadsheet that needed to be deleted. 9 years, 8 months, and 16 days reduced to a single word that made me sound like a pest control problem. The rest was a blur of corporate speak and fake sympathy. Something about last hired, first fired policies, which was rich considering I'd been there longer than half the management team. Something about a generous severance package that would barely cover 2 months of mortgage payments. Something about how this was nothing personal, which has got to be the biggest load of bull ever invented because losing your livelihood is pretty damn personal. Thank you very much. They handed me a cardboard box, an actual cardboard box, like in the movies, and gave me 30 minutes to pack up my stuff under the watchful eye of security. Because apparently, after nearly a decade of loyalty, I was suddenly a flight risk who might steal the company's staplers or make off with proprietary knowledge about manufacturing widgets. 30 minutes to pack up 10 years of your life. It's amazing how little you accumulate when you really think about it. A coffee mug Jordan had made me in second grade with "World's Okayest Dad" painted on it in crooked letters. A picture of the kids from last Christmas. A stress ball that had seen better days. A plant that Lila had insisted I needed to make my workspace more homey, even though it was half dead and probably violating several fire codes. The security guard, a guy named Bob who I'd chatted with hundreds of times about the weather and the Steelers' latest disappointing season, couldn't even look at me as he walked me to the door. Bob, who knew my kids' names and had shown me pictures of his grandchildren, suddenly treated me like I was radioactive. The handshake Pete gave me at the door was the kind of limp, half-hearted gesture you'd give to someone with a contagious disease. "Good luck, Marcus," he said, already looking past me to the next crisis on his agenda. And just like that, I was standing in the parking lot at 11:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, holding a cardboard box and wondering what the hell I was supposed to do with the rest of my life. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and the world was going about its business like nothing had happened. Like Marcus Sullivan's career hadn't just been flushed down the corporate toilet. The drive home was a special kind of torture. Every red light felt personal. Every song on the radio was either too depressing or too upbeat. I kept practicing how I was going to tell Marissa, running through different approaches like I was preparing for a presentation. Casual. "Hey honey, funny story about work today." Direct. "I got fired." Optimistic. "Well, this gives me a chance to explore new opportunities." Nothing sounded right, because there's no good way to tell your wife that you've just become the poster child for economic uncertainty. I pulled into our driveway at 12:23 p.m., which was exactly the kind of random Tuesday afternoon timing that would make Marissa suspicious even before I opened my mouth. She was probably expecting me to walk through the door at 6:15 p.m. like always, maybe complain about Pete's latest brilliant idea or mention that the coffee machine in the break room was acting up again. Instead, she got me stumbling through the front door with a cardboard box and the kind of shell-shocked expression usually reserved for natural disaster survivors. She was standing in the kitchen, still in her yoga pants and oversized sweater, coffee cup in hand, like she was posing for some kind of suburban lifestyle magazine. For a split second, I thought maybe this could work out. Maybe she'd be supportive. Maybe we'd face this challenge together like the team we used to be. I should have known better. "You're home early," she said, and there was already an edge in her voice. Marissa had developed a sixth sense for trouble over the years, probably from dealing with me. "Yeah, about that." I set the box down on our kitchen island, right next to the fruit bowl we never used and the stack of mail she'd been meaning to go through for 3 weeks. She looked at the box, looked at me, and I watched her face go through the 5 stages of realization: confusion, recognition, anger, disgust, and finally, that cold calculation that meant I was about to get the verbal equivalent of a root canal without anesthesia. "They fired you." It wasn't a question. The whole department got cut. "Budget restructuring," they said. Of course they did. She set her coffee cup down hard enough that I was surprised it didn't shatter. "Of course this would happen now. Do you have any idea what kind of position this puts us in?" And there it was. Not, "I'm sorry this happened to you," or "We'll figure this out together," or even "That sucks, honey." Just immediate concern about how my failure was going to inconvenience her life. "I know this is tough, but I'll find something else. I've got experience, references." "References?" She laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. "Marcus, you worked the same job for 10 years. You never moved up, never tried to better yourself, never pushed for more responsibility. What exactly are you going to put on a resume that's going to impress anyone?" Each word hit like a physical blow. This was my wife, the woman who used to tell me she loved my steady nature, my reliability, my commitment to providing for our family. Now she was using those same qualities as weapons. "I worked hard for this family. You worked, Marcus. There's a difference." She started pacing, which was never a good sign. "You went to work, you came home, you watched TV, you went to bed. That's not working hard. That's just existing." I stood there holding my cardboard box of professional failure, watching the woman I'd loved for 12 years tear apart everything I thought I was. But she wasn't done. Not even close. She stopped pacing and looked me dead in the eyes with the kind of cold precision that would make a surgeon jealous. What she said next didn't just cut, it eviscerated. You know what, Marcus? I've been thinking about this for a while now, and today just confirms it. You're just a mistake I made. I'm taking the kids. The box slipped from my hands and hit the floor. 9 years, 8 months, and 16 days of my working life scattered across our kitchen tiles, but all I could hear were those words echoing in my head. A mistake I made. A mistake I made. A mistake I made. Marissa, wait. No, I'm done waiting. I'm done pretending this is working. I'm done making excuses for why I settled for someone with no ambition, no drive, no future. She was already moving, grabbing her purse, her keys, calling for Jordan and Lila. My children. My babies. Jordan, who was 8 and still believed I was the strongest man in the world. Lila, who was 6, and drew me pictures of us holding hands under rainbow skies. They came running when she called, backpacks already packed like she'd been planning this. Dad, Jordan looked confused, scared. Where are we going? I knelt down to their level, trying to find words that wouldn't scar them for life. You're going to stay with Aunt Claire for a little while, buddy. Mommy and Daddy need to figure some things out. Lila wrapped her arms around my neck. Are you coming too, Daddy? I felt my throat close up, felt everything I was supposed to be as a man, as a father, as a provider, crumbling around me. Not right now, sweetheart, but I'll see you soon, okay? Promise. That one word, spoken in my 6-year-old daughter's voice, broke something inside me that I didn't even know could break. Promise. Marissa herded them toward the door like she was evacuating a burning building, and maybe she was. Maybe our marriage, our family, our life together had been on fire for longer than I'd realized, and I'd just been too stupid or too stubborn to smell the smoke. I stood in my doorway, still in my work clothes, watching my wife load my children into her Honda Pilot. Jordan pressed his face to the window and waved at me, and I waved back like everything was normal, like this was just another Tuesday, like my whole world wasn't driving away in a used SUV with 87,000 miles on it. The taillights disappeared around the corner, and I was alone in a house that suddenly felt like a museum dedicated to a life I used to have. Their absence was so complete, so absolute, that I could hear the refrigerator humming, the clock ticking, the sound of my own breathing. I closed the door and leaned against it, staring at the cardboard box and its scattered contents on my kitchen floor. The coffee mug Jordan had made me lay on its side. World's okayest dad, staring up at me like an accusation. Okayest dad. Not even that, apparently. The day had started with an alarm clock at 5:30 a.m. and a routine I'd followed for almost 10 years. It was ending with me standing in an empty house, unemployed, separated, and wondering how everything I thought I was had disappeared in the span of a single afternoon. They say when it rains, it pours. But this wasn't rain. This was the complete and total demolition of Marcus Sullivan, and I was standing in the wreckage wondering if there was anything left worth salvaging. You know what they don't tell you about rock bottom? It's not actually a place you arrive at with some dramatic flourish and a neon sign that says, "Congratulations, your life officially sucks." No, rock bottom is more like quicksand. You keep thinking you've hit the worst of it, and then you sink a little deeper. I spent the first hour after Marissa left doing what any rational, mature adult would do in my situation. I sat on my couch and stared at the wall like it might suddenly start dispensing life advice or lottery numbers. The silence in the house was so thick you could have cut it with a butter knife and served it at a depression buffet. Every few minutes, I'd catch myself listening for Jordan's laugh or Lila's footsteps running down the hallway. Instead, I got the steady tick of the wall clock that Marissa had bought from some overpriced home decor store because it was rustic chic. Right now, it sounded less rustic chic and more like a time bomb counting down to my complete mental breakdown. By hour 2, I'd moved on to walking around the house like a ghost haunting his own life. I kept finding little reminders of the family I used to have. Lila's Barbie shoes under the coffee table, Jordan's Pokemon cards scattered on the kitchen counter, Marissa's coffee ring stains on the side table that I'd nagged her about for months. Funny how those stains didn't seem so important anymore. The refrigerator was covered in Lila's artwork, stick figure families with disproportionately large heads and smiles that took up half their faces. In every single drawing, there was me, identifiable by my brown hair and the fact that I was always holding her hand. Daddy and me at the park. Daddy and me making pancakes. Daddy and me and Rainbow. Each drawing was like a tiny knife to the chest, especially the one titled My Family, where she'd drawn all four of us under a house with a chimney that looked more like a rocket ship. We were all smiling in that picture, even the dog we didn't have, but that Lila kept insisting we needed. By hour 3, I was rifling through the junk drawer looking for, hell, I don't know what I was looking for. Maybe a manual titled, What to Do When Your Life Implodes in a Single Day, or a business card for a miracle worker who specialized in unfucking completely fucked situations. Instead, I found expired coupons for Pizza Hut, 17 different pins that didn't work, a warranty card for a toaster we'd thrown away 2 years ago, and a photo booth strip from Jordan's 7th birthday party at Chuck E. Cheese. All four of us crammed into that tiny booth, making goofy faces at the camera. Marissa was actually laughing in one of them, a real laugh, not the bitter, sarcastic kind that had become her trademark lately. That's when I realized I needed to get the hell out of that house before I completely lost it. The problem with spontaneous evening drives when your life has just gone up in flames is that you don't really have a destination in mind. You just drive, hoping that somehow the act of moving forward will translate into actual progress instead of just burning gas while your soul stays parked in the same miserable spot. I ended up on Route 9, the kind of two-lane highway that cuts through small towns like a surgical scar. It was past 8 o'clock, and the world had settled into that particular kind of darkness that makes everything look like a scene from a movie about people whose lives are falling apart. Which, considering my current situation, felt pretty damn appropriate. The radio was playing some country song about a guy whose wife left him for his best friend, because apparently the universe has a twisted sense of humor and thought I needed a soundtrack to my misery. I clicked it off and drove in silence, watching the occasional streetlight throw shadows across my windshield like it was putting on a puppet show about loneliness. That's when I saw it. A small roadside diner with a flickering neon sign that read, Mel's 24-hour cafe. Except the 24 was dark and the hour kept blinking like it had a nervous twitch. It was the kind of place that probably served coffee strong enough to wake the dead and pie that was either absolutely amazing or a health code violation waiting to happen. The parking lot had maybe 3 cars in it, which on any other night might have made me keep driving. But this wasn't any other night, and honestly, the idea of sitting in a booth surrounded by other people, even strangers, sounded better than going home to a house full of ghosts. The bell above the door jangled when I walked in, and the smell hit me immediately. Coffee, bacon grease, and that particular diner smell that's part nostalgia, part disinfectant, and part dreams deferred. It was exactly what you'd expect from a place called Mel's, assuming Mel had given up on interior decorating sometime around 1987 and never looked back. The decor was what you might charitably call vintage Americana, or, more accurately, stuff that was already outdated when it was new. Red vinyl booths with duct tape patches, a counter with stools that squeaked when you turned them, and walls covered with faded photographs of local high school football teams and what I assumed were Mel's family members looking uncomfortable in formal wear. There was a trucker at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee and staring at his phone like it contained the secrets of the universe. A middle-aged couple in one of the booths was having the kind of quiet, intense conversation that usually ends with someone sleeping on the couch. And in the far corner, an elderly woman sat alone, cutting her pie into precise, geometric pieces like she was performing surgery. The waitress looked like she'd been working there since the Carter administration, bleached blonde hair teased into a style that defied both gravity and good judgment, and a name tag that read Dolores in cheerful letters that seemed ironically optimistic given her expression. "Sit anywhere you want, hon," she called out, barely looking up from wiping down the counter with a rag that had seen better decades. I slid into a booth in the corner, partly because I wanted to be alone with my thoughts and partly because the vinyl was less cracked than the other options. The table was one of those Formica numbers with a pattern that looked like someone had spilled a kaleidoscope on it, and it was decorated with the kind of small, sticky rings that told the story of 1,000 coffee cups and a cleaning routine that was more aspirational than actual. Dolores appeared at my table with the kind of efficiency that comes from 40 years of practice and a complete lack of patience for small talk. She set down a coffee cup that looked like it had survived several minor earthquakes and filled it with coffee that was dark enough to be classified as a petroleum product. Menu? She asked, already reaching into her apron. Just coffee's fine, I said, because the idea of eating anything seemed about as appealing as performing my own root canal. She shrugged and moved on to refill the trucker's cup, leaving me alone with my coffee and my thoughts. The coffee was actually pretty good, strong enough to put hair on your chest and bitter enough to match my mood. I found myself staring into the dark surface, watching my reflection waver like I was looking into some kind of caffeinated crystal ball. That's when I noticed her watching me. The elderly woman in the corner had stopped dissecting her pie and was staring at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Not in a creepy way, but in the way that made you feel like you were being evaluated for something you hadn't signed up for. She was probably in her 70s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a bun that looked like it could survive a tornado and eyes that seemed way too sharp for someone her age. She was wearing a dark blue sweater that had probably been expensive once upon a time and a string of pearls that looked real enough to fund a small vacation. But it was her expression that got to me. She was looking at me like she'd seen a ghost, not scared, but shocked, like the universe had just played a practical joke on her that she wasn't sure how to handle. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my coffee and the ambient diner sounds, the sizzle of the grill, the murmur of conversation, the distant hum of the ice machine, having what sounded like a mechanical nervous breakdown. But I could feel her eyes on me, and after about 5 minutes of pretending to be fascinated by the sugar dispenser, I finally looked up and met her gaze. That's when she got up. She moved slowly, carefully, like someone who'd learned not to trust her own balance but was too stubborn to admit it. She carried her coffee cup in her purse, one of those structured leather jobs that probably weighed more than a small child, and approached my table with the kind of determined purpose usually reserved for people on important missions. "Excuse me," she said, and her voice had that particular quality that comes with age and a lifetime of speaking her mind. "I'm sorry to bother you, but..." She paused, studying my face like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "You look just like my son." Great, I thought. On top of everything else, now I'm attracting senior citizens with mommy issues. But there was something in her tone that kept me from being a complete ass about it. "That's nice," I said, trying to strike the right balance between polite and dismissive. "May I?" She gestured to the seat across from me. Every instinct I had told me to say no, to make some excuse about needing to get going, to avoid whatever emotional baggage this stranger was about to unload on me. But honestly, where the hell did I have to go? Home to my empty house and my wall of children's artwork? Back to driving aimlessly through the darkness like some kind of suburban ghost? "Sure," I said, and she slid into the booth with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to navigate the world despite a body that was no longer cooperating with her plans. She set her coffee cup down and arranged herself in the seat, smoothing her sweater and adjusting her purse strap like she was preparing for a job interview. Then she looked at me again with those sharp eyes, and I felt like I was being x-rayed. "My name is Agnes," she said. "Agnes Hartwell. And you really do look remarkably like my son, David." "Marcus," I said, because it seemed rude not to introduce myself to someone who'd just compared me to her offspring. "Marcus." She repeated my name like she was testing how it felt in her mouth. "That's a strong name. A good name. Thanks, I guess. My parents picked it." She smiled at that, just a small upturn of her lips that made her whole face soften. Parents do their best with names. "We hope we're giving our children something that will serve them well in life." There was something in the way she said it that made me pay attention, some undercurrent of sadness that I recognized because I'd been swimming in it myself all day. "So this son of yours," I said, partly out of politeness and partly because I was curious. "He live around here?" And that's when her face changed completely. The small smile disappeared, replaced by something that looked like pain wrapped in resignation and tied up with 35 years of regret. "No," she said quietly. "He's been missing for 35 years. The coffee in my mouth suddenly tasted like ash. I set the cup down carefully, watching as Agnes stared past me toward the diner's front window, her eyes focused on something I couldn't see. 35 years, she repeated, and her voice carried the weight of every single one of those days. "He would be about your age now, if..." She trailed off, leaving that thought hanging in the air between us like smoke. I didn't know what to say to that. What do you say to someone who's been carrying that kind of loss for 3.5 decades? Sorry, that sucks. Hope you find him someday. Everything sounded inadequate and stupid. I'm sorry, I said anyway, because it was all I had. She nodded, accepting my words with the grace of someone who'd heard them many times before. Thank you. It's strange, you know, seeing someone who looks so much like he did, like seeing a glimpse of the life that might have been. Agnes reached into her purse and pulled out an old wallet, the kind with plastic sleeves for photos. Her hands shook slightly as she flipped through it, and I found myself holding my breath as she found what she was looking for. This was David at 28, she said, sliding the photo across the table. I looked down at the picture and felt my stomach drop. The guy in the photo could have been my brother. Same dark hair, same jawline, same eyes that looked like they were trying to figure out what came next. He was standing next to a car, some kind of old Ford, wearing jeans and a t-shirt and smiling at whoever was taking the picture. Jesus, I whispered, because the resemblance was uncanny enough to be unsettling. He disappeared on a Tuesday in March 1990. Agnes continued, her voice taking on the mechanical quality of someone who'd told this story too many times. Left for work in the morning, never came home. They found his car 3 days later at a truck stop 200 miles away. No sign of him, no note, no explanation. Just gone. She took the photo back and stared at it for a long moment before tucking it away in her wallet. The police investigated, of course. Missing persons, all that. But David was 28, legally an adult, no signs of foul play. They assumed he'd left on his own, started a new life somewhere else. Her laugh was bitter. Maybe he did. Maybe he's got a family somewhere. Kids who don't know they have a grandmother who still sets an extra place at Christmas dinner. The weight of her sadness was crushing, and I found myself thinking about Jordan and Lila, about how they'd looked when Marissa loaded them into the car, about the promise I'd made to Lila that I'd see them soon. Have you ever stopped looking? I asked. Agnes shook her head. How do you stop looking for your child? Even when everyone tells you to move on, to accept that he's probably dead or doesn't want to be found. How do you just stop? She leaned forward slightly, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it hit me like a sledgehammer. But he's been missing for 35 years, and I've spent 35 years regretting every moment I didn't tell him I loved him, every time I chose work over time with him, every argument we had that I never got to take back. Her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me squirm. Don't abandon them like me, Marcus. Whatever's going wrong in your life, whatever brought you to this diner at this hour looking like the world just ended, don't abandon them like me. Agnes's words hit me like a freight train carrying a cargo load of uncomfortable truths, and suddenly I was drowning in memories I'd spent years trying not to think about. Sitting in that cracked vinyl booth with my lukewarm coffee and a stranger's grief weighing down the air between us, my mind decided to take an unauthorized trip down memory lane. The kind of trip where every stop is more depressing than the last. Don't abandon them like me. The words echoed in my head as I stared into my coffee cup, and suddenly I wasn't 34-year-old Marcus Sullivan sitting in a rundown diner. I was 8 years old again, standing in the doorway of my dad's garage, watching him work magic on engines that most people would have written off as scrap metal. Harold Sullivan, my old man, was the kind of guy who could make a 1987 Chevy Malibu with 200,000 miles on it purr like a satisfied cat. He had these massive hands that were permanently stained with motor oil and calloused from 40 years of honest work, but he could thread a bolt with the delicacy of a surgeon. Dad didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened, because Harold Sullivan had never wasted a word in his entire life. Come here, Marcus, he'd say, not looking up from whatever automotive puzzle he was solving that day. Let me show you something. And I'd run over like my shoes were on fire, because there was nothing cooler in my 8-year-old world than watching my dad turn a pile of mechanical junk into something that actually worked. He'd explain how the engine was like a heartbeat, how every part had to work together or the whole thing would fall apart. He taught me the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver, how to check oil, and why you never, ever shortcut a repair job. A man is measured by how he stands when the world crumbles around him, son, he told me one Saturday afternoon when we were working on Mrs. Henderson's ancient Buick. She couldn't afford to take it to the fancy shop downtown, So Dad fixed it for free and pretended like the $20 she insisted on giving him was adequate payment. It ain't about being the loudest or the smartest or the richest. It's about still being there when everyone else gives up and goes home. At the time, I thought he was talking about car repair. Turns out he was talking about life, and I'd been too young and stupid to realize I was getting the most important lesson I'd ever receive. Dad was diagnosed with lung cancer when I was 16. 2 packs a day for 30 years will do that to you, the doctor said with all the bedside manner of a tax auditor. He fought it for 18 months with the same quiet determination he brought to everything else, never complaining, never asking why him, just showing up for chemo appointments and radiation treatments like they were just another job that needed doing. The last conversation we had was in his hospital room 3 days before he died. He was so thin by then that he looked like a shadow of himself, but his eyes were still sharp, still focused. "You taking care of your mother?" he asked, because even with death knocking on his door, Harold Sullivan was worried about everyone else first. "Yeah, Dad. She's doing okay." "Good. That's good." He was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the parking lot like it contained the secrets of the universe. Then he turned back to me. "You remember what I taught you about standing firm?" "Yeah, Dad. I remember." "Good. You're gonna need that. Life's gonna try to knock you down more times than you can count, son. The measure of a man ain't whether he falls. Everybody falls. It's whether he gets back up." He died 2 days later in his sleep, and I swear the last thing he did was squeeze my mom's hand to let her know it was okay to let go. Mom, Leona, was the opposite of Dad in every way that mattered, which is probably why they worked so well together for 31 years. Where Dad was quiet, she was talkative. Where he was cautious, she was spontaneous. Where he fixed things with his hands, she fixed them with her heart and an endless supply of homemade cookies. Leona Sullivan believed in second chances the way other people believe in gravity, completely, without question, and with the understanding that the world would fall apart without them. She was the woman who'd invite the neighborhood kids in for lunch when their parents were working, who'd drive elderly Mrs. Peterson to doctor's appointments without being asked, who'd somehow always have an extra casserole in the freezer for families going through rough times. "Everyone deserves another chance, Marcus," she'd say whenever I'd complain about some kid at school being mean or some teacher being unfair. People don't wake up wanting to be difficult. Usually, they're just scared or hurt or overwhelmed. A little kindness goes a long way. She remarried when I was 22, a guy named Frank who owned a hardware store and treated her like she was made of precious metals. Some kids might have been weird about their mom dating someone new, but Frank made her laugh in a way I hadn't heard since Dad died, and that was enough for me. "Your father would have liked Frank," she told me at their wedding reception, dancing with me to some old Elvis song while Frank chatted with the relatives. "He would have appreciated a man who knows the value of treating people right." Mom died in a car accident when I was 26, just 2 weeks after Jordan was born. Some drunk asshole ran a red light and hit her car while she was coming home from the grocery store, carrying the stuffed elephant she'd bought for her new grandson. The irony wasn't lost on me. Leona Sullivan, who'd spent her entire life taking care of everyone else, killed by someone who couldn't be bothered to call a cab. I named Jordan after her maiden name. Jordan was her grandfather's name, the one who taught her about kindness and second chances. Marissa thought it was sweet at the time. Another thing that used to matter to her that she'd probably use as ammunition now. Sitting in that diner booth, watching Agnes carefully fold and unfold her napkin like it was a meditation, I realized how completely I'd failed to live up to the lessons my parents had spent years trying to teach me. Dad's lesson about standing firm when the world crumbles? I'd been knocked down by the first real punch life threw at me. Mom's lesson about kindness and second chances? I'd let bitterness and routine slowly poison my marriage until even I had trouble remembering why Marissa and I had fallen in love in the first place. Somewhere along the way, I'd traded Harold Sullivan's quiet strength for passive acceptance. I'd confused showing up with actually being present. I'd convinced myself that clocking in at the factory every day for 9 years and coming home to watch TV was the same thing as building a life worth living. "You okay, hon?" Dolores appeared at my elbow with a coffee pot, breaking me out of my trip down regret memory lane. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," I muttered, holding out my cup for a refill. Agnes was still sitting across from me, but she'd gone quiet, lost in her own memories. I wondered if she was thinking about David at 28, about all the conversations they'd never had and all the chances they'd never get to take back their last argument. "Can I ask you something?" I said, and she looked up from her napkin origami. "Of course. What was he like? Your son, I mean, David." A small smile crossed her face, the first genuine one I'd seen from her all evening. "Stubborn. God, was he stubborn. Once he made up his mind about something, you couldn't change it with dynamite and a crowbar." She paused, staring past me again. "But he was also loyal. Fiercely loyal. He'd defend his friends even when they didn't deserve it, help neighbors even when they hadn't been particularly neighborly to him. He worked construction, saved up for months to buy me a necklace for my 50th birthday. Said every woman deserved to feel beautiful, especially his mother. Sounds like a good guy. He was. He really was. But I spent so much time worried about him making the wrong choices that I forgot to appreciate the right ones. I worked double shifts at the hospital, thinking I was providing for him, thinking that money was the same thing as love. By the time I realized I'd been substituting showing up to work for showing up for my son, it was too late. The parallel hit me like a slap to the face. How many times had I used work as an excuse not to engage with Jordan and Lila? How many times had I told myself that providing for them financially was the same thing as being their father? How many school plays had I missed because I'd picked up overtime? How many bedtime stories had I skipped because I was too tired from another day of providing for my family? I thought being steady was enough, I said, more to myself than to Agnes. I thought showing up every day, keeping a job, paying the bills. I thought that was what being a man meant. And now, I thought about Marissa's words. "You're just a mistake I made," and how they'd cut deeper than losing my job ever could. I thought about Jordan's confused face when I told him I wouldn't be coming with them to Aunt Claire's. I thought about Lila's tiny arms around my neck and her voice asking me to promise I'd see her soon. "Now I think I confused existing with living," I said. I thought that if I just kept my head down and did what I was supposed to do, everything would work out. Like life was some kind of test where you get points for showing up and following the rules. Agnes nodded slowly. "David used to say that the world was full of people sleepwalking through their lives. He said most people spend so much time worried about tomorrow that they forget to live today. Smart kid. Too smart, maybe. He saw things other people missed. He'd notice when someone was sad, when they needed help, when they were pretending everything was fine. He couldn't stand seeing people suffer in silence." I thought about my dad fixing Mrs. Henderson's Buick for free, about my mom bringing casseroles to families in need, about the lessons they'd tried to teach me that I'd somehow managed to forget in the process of becoming a responsible adult. "My parents tried to teach me that," I said, "about standing firm, about kindness, about being there for people. Somewhere along the way, I guess I started thinking that meant just enduring, just getting through each day without falling apart." "Maybe," Agnes said gently. "The difference between enduring and standing firm is that one is about surviving and the other is about fighting for something worth surviving for." She finished her coffee and started gathering her things, her purse, her wallet with David's photo, her sweater that had probably seen decades of similar late-night conversations with strangers. "I should go," she said, sliding out of the booth with the careful movements of someone whose body had started betraying her. "But Marcus." "Yeah. Whatever brought you to this diner tonight, whatever's broken in your life, it's not too late to fix it. I've spent 35 years learning that lesson the hard way." She paused at my table, looking down at me with those sharp eyes that seemed to see straight through all my excuses and self-pity. "Don't abandon them like me," she repeated, and this time it wasn't just a warning. It was a plea from a mother who'd learned the difference between providing for someone and actually being there for them about 3 decades too late. I watched her walk to the counter, pay her check, and disappear into the night, leaving me alone with my cold coffee and the uncomfortable realization that I'd been sleepwalking through my own life for years. My parents had given me a blueprint for being a man worth respecting, Harold's quiet strength and Leona's endless capacity for second chances. Instead, I'd settled for being Marcus the factory guy, Marcus the reliable provider, Marcus who showed up but never really arrived. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to remember who Harold and Leona Sullivan had raised me to be. You know what's funny about marriage? Not funny haha, but funny in that twisted, cosmic joke kind of way. You can pinpoint the exact moment when you fell in love, but the moment when it all starts falling apart is like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. One day you're a team, and then suddenly you're two strangers sharing a mortgage and arguing about whose turn it is to take out the trash. Sitting in that diner, staring at the grease stains on the table while Agnes's words echoed in my head, I found myself thinking about Marissa, not the woman who'd looked me in the eye today and called me a mistake, but the girl I'd fallen for 12 years ago when we were both young enough to think love was enough to fix anything. We met at a barbecue at my buddy Steve's house. I was 22, fresh out of a community college program for industrial maintenance, and cocky as hell about landing my first real job at the factory. Marissa was 20, working part-time at a dental office while finishing her associate's degree in business administration, and she had this laugh that could make you forget your own name. She was wearing a sundress with little flowers on it. Yellow daisies, I think, and she was arguing with Steve's girlfriend about whether The Godfather was better than Goodfellas. Most girls I knew didn't have opinions about Scorsese movies, but Marissa was defending her position like she was presenting a thesis, complete with specific examples and a ranking system for mob movie criteria. "You're wrong," I'd said, walking up to their conversation with a beer in my hand and all the confidence of a guy who hadn't been shot down yet that night. "Excuse me." She turned those green eyes on me, and I felt my carefully prepared argument about cinematography evaporate like spit on a hot sidewalk. "I mean, I think you're right. About The Godfather. It's definitely better." She smiled, this slow, amused smile that let me know she'd seen right through my smooth operator routine. "Oh, really? And what makes you such an expert on mob movies?" "Well, I've seen both of them. Twice." She laughed then, and it was like someone had turned on the lights in a room I didn't even know was dark. "Wow, twice. I'm clearly dealing with a film scholar here." We spent the next 3 hours sitting on Steve's back porch, talking about movies and music and the kinds of dreams you only share when you're young enough to believe they might actually come true. She wanted to own her own business someday, something in event planning or hospitality management. I told her about my plans to work my way up at the factory, maybe get into supervision, eventually buy a house with a garage where I could work on cars like my dad had. "You make me feel safe, Marcus," she said that night as I walked her to her car. "Like you're the kind of person who shows up when he says he will." Safe. That word followed me home that night and through the next week while I worked up the courage to call her. Safe wasn't sexy or exciting, but coming from Marissa, it felt like the highest compliment anyone had ever given me. In a world full of guys who were all flash and no substance, I was the steady one, the reliable one, the one who'd still be there when the excitement wore off. And for a while, God, for a long while, that was enough. Our first apartment was a shithole one-bedroom above a Chinese restaurant that made the whole place smell like sweet and sour pork, but we were so happy we might as well have been living in a palace. Marissa would come home from her job at the dental office, and I'd come home from the factory, and we'd sit on our second-hand couch eating takeout and planning our future like we were the first couple in history to figure out how this whole love thing was supposed to work. She'd curl up against my side while we watched TV, running her fingers through my hair and telling me about her day. The difficult patients, the office drama, the way Dr. Martinez would hit on the dental hygienists and act like he was God's gift to women with dental insurance. I'd tell her about the machinery I'd fixed, the guys I worked with, the satisfaction of solving problems with my hands instead of sitting behind a desk all day. "I love that about you," she'd say. "You actually make things work. You fix things instead of just complaining about them." We got married 3 years later in a small ceremony at her parents' church. Nothing fancy. We couldn't afford fancy, but Marissa looked like something out of a fairy tale in a dress she'd found at a consignment shop and altered herself. During our vows, she promised to love me for better or worse, in good times and bad, through whatever life throws at us. I believed her. Hell, I believed both of us. The first crack in our perfect little world appeared about a year after Jordan was born. Marissa had taken maternity leave from the dental office, and the combination of sleep deprivation, hormones, and being stuck in the house all day had turned my easygoing wife into someone I barely recognized. "I feel like I'm disappearing," she told me one night after Jordan had finally fallen asleep. "Like I'm just Jordan's mom and Marcus's wife, but I'm not Marissa anymore." "You're still Marissa," I'd said, because it seemed like the right thing to say. Am I? When's the last time I did something just for me? When's the last time we had a conversation that wasn't about diapers or bills or whose turn it is to do laundry? I didn't have an answer for that, mainly because she was right. Our conversations had become logistics meetings: who was picking up Jordan from daycare, whether we needed milk, why the water bill was higher this month. We'd stopped talking about dreams and movies in the future and started talking about immediate problems that needed immediate solutions. It's just a phase, I told her. All new parents go through this. But it wasn't just a phase. It was the beginning of a slow erosion that would take years to complete, like water wearing away stones so gradually that you don't notice the damage until the whole foundation crumbles. When Lila came along 2 years later, things got worse instead of better. Marissa went back to work part-time, but she was exhausted all the time, and I was picking up extra shifts to cover the additional expenses. Our conversations became even more transactional: grocery lists and school schedules, and who was going to stay home with sick kids. "You never really talk to me anymore," she said one night while we were folding laundry in front of the TV. "You come home, you eat dinner, you watch whatever game is on, and you go to bed. It's like living with a roommate who occasionally pays bills." "I'm tired, Marissa. I work 40+ hours a week, so you can work part-time and be home with the kids more. What do you want from me? I want you to want to talk to me. I want you to ask about my day and actually listen to the answer. I want you to notice when I get my hair cut or when I'm having a hard time with something. I notice things." "Really? What did I do today before you got home?" I stared at the TV, trying to remember if she'd mentioned anything that morning over breakfast. Had she said something about taking the kids somewhere? Meeting someone for lunch? Going to the store? "I don't know," I admitted. Took Lila to her pediatrician appointment. Dropped Jordan off at soccer practice. Grocery shopped. Picked up your dry cleaning. Paid bills. Called your mother to wish her happy birthday. Made dinner. And helped Jordan with his homework. But you don't know because you never ask. That fight ended like most of our fights, with both of us apologizing and promising to do better, and then falling back into the same patterns a week later. I tried to be more engaged for a few days, asking about her day and making an effort to put down my phone during dinner. She tried to be more understanding about how tired I was after work. But eventually, we'd slip back into our respective corners, coexisting instead of connecting. The real poison, though, came from her family. Specifically, her sister Claire, who'd married some hotshot lawyer and lived in a house that was featured in the local magazine's Homes of Distinction issue. Claire had opinions about everything: our car, our neighborhood, my job, my clothes, and especially my apparent lack of ambition. "Marcus seems comfortable," she'd say during family gatherings, making comfortable sound like a terminal illness. "Some people are just content with where they are, I suppose." Her friends weren't much better. A bunch of wine mom types who spent their days at yoga classes and charity luncheons, married to guys who wore suits to work and talked about investment portfolios at dinner parties. They'd ask what I did for a living, and when I said I worked at the factory, they'd get that look, the one that said they were already calculating how quickly they could change the subject. "Marissa, you're so lucky to have such a practical husband," one of them said at a barbecue last summer. "Someone who's not caught up in all that career ambition nonsense." But Marissa stopped feeling lucky. Slowly, steadily, my reliability became stagnation in her eyes. My contentment with providing for my family became lack of drive. My satisfaction with honest work became settling for mediocrity. "Don't you want more?" she asked me during one of our increasingly frequent arguments about money. "Don't you want to move up, make more money, give the kids better opportunities?" "I make decent money. We have a nice house. The kids are happy. Decent money. A nice house." She repeated my words like they tasted bitter. "God, Marcus, is that really all you want out of life? To be decent? To be fine? To be okay? What's wrong with okay?" "Everything," she exploded. "Everything is wrong with okay. Okay is giving up. Okay is settling. Okay is looking at your life and deciding that this is as good as it gets." That conversation happened 6 months ago, but I could still hear the frustration in her voice, the way she said, "okay," like it was a 4-letter word. And maybe, sitting in that diner with Agnes's warning still ringing in my ears, I was finally starting to understand what she meant. I'd spent so many years thinking that showing up was enough that I'd stopped trying to actually excel at anything. I'd convinced myself that steady was the same thing as strong, that reliable was the same thing as remarkable. I'd taken the lessons my parents taught me about standing firm and twisted them into an excuse for standing still. Somewhere along the way, "You make me feel safe" had become, "You make me feel trapped," and I'd been too comfortable in my own contentment to notice the difference. My wife had stopped seeing me as her partner and started seeing me as an obstacle to the life she actually wanted. And the hell of it was, she wasn't entirely wrong. I had gotten comfortable. I had stopped pushing for more. I had settled into a routine that felt like success, but probably looked like surrender to anyone watching from the outside. "You're just a mistake I made." The words hit differently now, sitting in that booth with cold coffee and colder realizations. Not just cruel, but accurate. Because the man she'd fallen in love with, the one who'd had dreams and ambitions and plans for the future, had gradually been replaced by someone who was content to clock in, come home, and repeat the same day over and over until death or retirement, whichever came first. Maybe I really had become a mistake. Maybe the Marcus she'd married had disappeared so slowly that neither of us had noticed until it was too late to get him back. Agnes had been gone for maybe 10 minutes, but her presence still lingered in that booth like the ghost of conversations past. I was nursing what had to be my fourth cup of Dolores's industrial-strength coffee, staring at the sugar dispenser and trying to process everything that had just happened when she came back. I looked up, surprised to see her standing next to my table again, clutching her purse like it contained state secrets. Her face was different now, more determined, less fragile. Like she'd walked out to her car, sat there for a few minutes, and made some kind of decision that required her to march back in here and finish what she'd started. "I'm sorry," she said, sliding back into the booth across from me without asking permission this time. "I couldn't leave without telling you something else." "Okay," I said, because what else do you say to a woman who's been carrying 35 years of regret around like a backpack full of rocks? She leaned forward, her hands flat on the table, and when she spoke, her voice had the intensity of someone confessing their deepest sin. "I worked too much when David was growing up. Double shifts at the hospital, overtime whenever I could get it. I told myself I was providing for him, giving him opportunities one never had." Her eyes were locked on mine, and I felt like she was seeing straight through to all the excuses I'd been making for the past decade. But the truth is, I was hiding. Work was easier than being a parent, easier than having difficult conversations, easier than dealing with his problems, easier than admitting I had no idea what I was doing half the time. The words hit me like a punch to the gut because I recognized the pattern. How many times had I picked up extra shifts instead of going to Jordan's baseball games? How many times had I claimed I was working late when really I just didn't want to deal with Marissa's complaints about our finances or our marriage or my apparent lack of ambition? When David was 17, he wanted to talk to me about something. I could tell it was important. He kept starting sentences and then stopping, kept hovering around the kitchen while I was getting ready for work. But I was already running late, and Mrs. Patterson in room 314 needed her medication adjusted. And there was always something that seemed more urgent than whatever my teenage son wanted to discuss. She paused, and I watched her fingers trace patterns on the table like she was writing invisible apologies. I told him we'd talk when I got home. "Later, David. We'll talk later." But when I got home at midnight, he was already asleep, and the next morning he was rushing off to school. And then there was another shift, another emergency, another excuse to put off that conversation. "Did you ever find out what he wanted to talk about?" Agnes shook her head, and I saw tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. "That's the thing about later, Marcus. Sometimes later never comes." A few months after that, David graduated and got his own apartment. He'd call every couple of weeks, but the calls got shorter and shorter. He was pulling away, and I told myself it was natural, that boys his age needed independence. She took a shaky breath. The morning he disappeared, he called me at work. Said he needed to talk, asked if I could meet him for lunch. But I had 3 patients scheduled and a staff meeting, and I told him, I told him I was too busy. I said we'd talk that weekend. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of missed opportunities and words that would never be spoken. "That weekend never came," she whispered. "And I've spent 35 years wondering what he wanted to tell me, wondering if maybe he was in some kind of trouble and needed help, wondering if I'd just listened. If I'd just made time for one conversation, he might still be here." She reached across the table and grabbed my hand with surprising strength, her eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made me want to look away but couldn't. Don't abandon them like me, Marcus. 5 words. 5 simple words that hit me like a lightning bolt, illuminating every corner of my soul where I'd been hiding from the truth about what kind of father I'd become. Not don't leave them, or don't give up on them, but don't abandon them like me. Because abandonment isn't just about packing up and disappearing. Sometimes it's about being physically present but emotionally absent. Sometimes it's about choosing work over bedtime stories, overtime over family dinners, the safety of routine over the messy, complicated work of actually connecting with the people you love. I sat there staring at this woman who'd just handed me the roadmap to every mistake I'd been making for years, and I finally understood what she was really telling me. She wasn't just warning me not to leave my kids. She was warning me not to be the kind of father who's always too busy for the conversations that matter, too tired for the moments that count, too comfortable with later to realize that later might never come. I hear you, I said, and my voice came out rougher than I expected. Agnes squeezed my hand one more time, and then let go, sitting back in the booth with the exhausted expression of someone who'd just transferred 35 years of hard-earned wisdom to a stranger in a diner. Good, she said simply. That's all I wanted. For someone to hear what I should have learned before it was too late. Something shifted inside me when Agnes said those 5 words, something I hadn't felt in years, maybe decades. It wasn't anger, though God knows I had plenty of that swirling around after the day I'd had. It wasn't desperation either, though I'd been drowning in that particular emotion since Marissa loaded the kids into her car and drove away from our house, like she was fleeing a crime scene. No, this was something else entirely. Something that felt like waking up after a long, dreamless sleep to find out you've been sleepwalking through your own life. For the first time all day, hell, for the first time in years, I felt resolve. Real, honest-to-God determination that came from somewhere deeper than my wounded pride or my fear of being alone. It came from that place where you store the things that actually matter, the place I'd been ignoring while I focused on showing up. To work and paying bills and convincing myself that going through the motions was the same thing as living. Agnes, I said, and she looked up from her coffee cup with those sharp eyes that seemed to see everything I'd been trying to hide from myself. I don't know if I have the strength to face Marissa right now. I don't know if I'm strong enough to fight for something that might already be dead. It was the first completely honest thing I'd said out loud in months, maybe years. Not the kind of filtered, careful honesty you use when you're trying to avoid an argument, but the raw, ugly truth that makes your chest tight and your throat close up. Agnes reached across the table and grabbed my hand again. But this time her grip was different. Not the desperate clutch of someone drowning in regret, but the firm, steady hold of someone who'd learned the hard way what was worth fighting for. Strength doesn't wait for permission, Marcus, she said, and her voice had the authority of someone who'd spent 35 years learning that lesson the most painful way possible. It doesn't show up when you feel ready, or when the circumstances are perfect, or when you're sure you're going to win. She leaned forward, and I could see decades of hard-earned wisdom written in the lines around her eyes. Strength shows up when you realize that not fighting is worse than losing. When you understand that giving up means living with the kind of regret that follows you around like a shadow for the rest of your life. Her words hit me like a slap that wakes you up from a bad dream. Because she was right. Not fighting meant accepting that I was the kind of man who'd let his children grow up believing their father didn't think they were worth the effort. Not fighting meant proving Marissa right about me being a mistake she'd made. Go to them, Agnes said, and now her voice was gentle but insistent, like a mother talking to a child who's afraid to get back on a bike after falling. Tonight. Right now. Don't wait until tomorrow or next week or when you feel more prepared. Don't give yourself time to talk yourself out of it. I felt something ignite in my chest. Not the raging fire of anger or the desperate flame of panic, but the steady, sustainable burn of purpose. For the first time in years, I had a clear mission that had nothing to do with clocking in or paying bills or maintaining the status quo. I had to get to my kids. I had to look Jordan and Lila in the eyes and tell them that their father wasn't the kind of man who disappeared when things got difficult. I had to prove to myself, and maybe to Marissa, that Marcus Sullivan still had some fight left in him. Thank you, I said to Agnes, but the words felt inadequate for what she'd just given me. She smiled. the first truly warm smile I'd seen from her all night. Don't thank me, Marcus. Just don't abandon them like me. I left a $10 bill on the table, grabbed my jacket, and headed for the door with the kind of determined stride I hadn't used in years. Outside, the night air hit my face like a wake-up call, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as I walked toward my car. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, but not from fear or uncertainty. They were shaking with the kind of adrenaline that comes when you finally stop running away from something and turn around to face it head-on. I was driving toward my children, toward the most important fight of my life, and for once I wasn't worried about whether I was strong enough or prepared enough or good enough. I was just going. The drive to Claire's house felt like the longest 23 minutes of my life, which is saying something considering I'd already lived through the worst day in recent memory. Every red light felt personal, every slow driver felt like a conspiracy, and every mile marker reminded me that I was driving toward a confrontation I had no idea how to handle. Claire lived in one of those suburban developments where all the houses looked like they were designed by the same architect who'd been told to make everything charming, but had never actually experienced charm himself. Perfect lawns, perfect driveways, perfect little mailboxes that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. It was the kind of neighborhood where having a lawnmower that wasn't a riding mower marked you as lower class, and where the homeowners association had opinions about your choice of garden gnomes. Marissa's Honda Pilot was parked in the driveway next to Claire's BMW, looking as out of place as I felt pulling up behind them in my 10-year-old Ford pickup with the dent in the tailgate from that time Jordan decided to help me load lumber and miscalculated the distance. I sat in my truck for a minute, engine still running, trying to figure out what the hell I was going to say. Agnes had filled me with all this resolve and determination, but she hadn't exactly provided a script for this situation. Hey Marissa, I know you think I'm a complete failure as a human being, but can I see my kids? Didn't seem like it was going to win me any points. The front door opened before I could finish psyching myself up, and there she was, my wife of 9 years, standing in Claire's perfectly manicured doorway with her arms crossed, and that expression on her face that I'd seen way too often lately. The one that said she was already 3 steps ahead of whatever pathetic argument I was about to make. Go home, Marcus, she called out before I'd even gotten out of the truck. This isn't the time. But something was different this time. Maybe it was Agnes's words still echoing in my head, or maybe it was the realization that I'd already lost everything that mattered anyway. So what was the worst that could happen? For the first time in years, I didn't feel that familiar urge to back down, to avoid the confrontation, to take the path of least resistance. I'm not leaving without seeing Jordan and Lila, I said, walking up her perfectly paved walkway with more confidence than I'd felt in years. Marissa's eyebrows shot up like I'd just announced I was running for president. Excuse me. You heard me. I want to see my kids. She stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind her like she was protecting Fort Knox from enemy infiltration. Marcus, you can't just show up here making demands. We talked about this. No, you talked about this. You made a unilateral decision to blow up our family and take my children away from me. I never agreed to any of it. Oh, please. She rolled her eyes with the kind of dramatic flair that would have made high school theater teachers proud. Don't act like you're some innocent victim here. You've been checked out of this marriage for years. Maybe I have been. Maybe we both have. But those are my kids in there, and I'm not going anywhere until I see them. Something in my tone must have gotten through to her, because her expression shifted slightly, not to agreement, exactly, but to surprise. Like she was seeing something in me that she'd forgotten existed, or maybe something that had never been there before. They're upset, Marcus. They don't understand what's happening, and seeing you right now. Dad. Jordan's voice cut through our standoff like a knife through butter. He was standing behind the screen door, still in his pajamas with his hair sticking up in 17 different directions, looking at us with those big brown eyes that were way too serious for an 8-year-old. Hey, buddy, I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended. Before Marissa could stop him, before anyone could stop him, Jordan pushed open the screen door and ran straight into my arms. 8 years old and already tall for his age, he hit me with the force of a small linebacker, wrapping his arms around my waist like he was afraid I might disappear if he didn't hold on tight enough. I thought you weren't coming, he said into my shirt, and I felt something break apart inside my chest. I'm here now, Jordan. I'm here. Dad, Dad, Dad. Lila's voice carried from inside the house. And then she was there too, all blonde curls and princess pajamas, launching herself at my legs with the fearless enthusiasm that only 6-year-olds possess. I knelt down so I could wrap both of them in my arms, and for the first time all day, the world felt like it made sense again. This was why Agnes's words had hit me so hard. This was what I'd been in danger of abandoning. Not through some dramatic exit, but through the slow, steady erosion of just not showing up when it mattered. Are you staying for breakfast, Daddy? Lila asked, looking up at me with those blue eyes that were identical to her mother's. I glanced up at Marissa, who was standing on the porch watching this reunion with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not the cold anger from earlier, but something more complicated. I don't know, sweetheart. That's up to Mommy. Claire's living room looked like it had been designed by someone who thought cozy meant aggressively beige. Everything matched in that soul-crushing way that screams, I hired a decorator and have no actual personality. But right now, sitting on her overpriced sectional with my kids curled up against me like they were afraid I might vanish, it felt like the most important room in the world. Daddy, why can't you come home with us? Lila asked, her small hand gripping my shirt with the determination of someone who'd learned not to let go of good things. I looked at Jordan, who was pretending to be interested in the TV, but was clearly listening to every word. At 8, he was old enough to sense the weight of adult problems even if he couldn't fully understand them. Sometimes grown-ups have problems they need to figure out, I said, choosing my words carefully. Mommy and Daddy are having some disagreements about things, but that doesn't change how much we love you guys. Are you getting divorced? Jordan asked bluntly, because kids have a way of cutting straight through all the bullshit adults use to avoid difficult conversations. Marissa shifted uncomfortably in the armchair across from us, and I could feel Claire hovering in the doorway like she was watching a particularly dramatic episode of her favorite soap opera. I don't know, buddy. Maybe. But here's what I do know. No matter what happens between Mommy and me, I will always be your dad. That never changes, no matter where we live or what paperwork gets signed. Promise. Lila looked up at me with those serious blue eyes that made my chest tight. Promise. Even if I can't live in the same house with you, even if things get complicated and confusing, I will never stop being your father. I will never stop showing up for you. Claire, who'd been suspiciously quiet through this whole exchange, finally spoke up. Marissa, maybe you should let him talk to them. They need to hear this. I nearly fell off the couch. Claire, the same Claire who'd been making subtle digs about my lack of ambition for years, was suddenly on my side. Marissa looked like she'd been slapped. Claire, we talked about this. We talked about you being angry and hurt. We didn't talk about what's best for Jordan and Lila. For the first time since this nightmare started, I felt like someone other than Agnes understood what was really at stake here. This wasn't just about Marissa and me working out our marital problems. This was about two kids who needed to know their father wouldn't disappear from their lives just because their parents couldn't figure out how to be married anymore. Look, I said, addressing Marissa directly but keeping my voice calm. I'm not here to argue with you or try to change your mind about us. If you want a divorce, we'll figure that out. But I'm not going to let my kids think their dad gave up on them. Marissa stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her processing this version of Marcus. The one who didn't back down, who didn't apologize for taking up space, who finally understood the difference between being present and just showing up. Fine, she said quietly. But this doesn't fix anything between us. I know, I replied. But maybe it fixes something between me and them. The weeks that followed were brutal in ways I hadn't expected. Marissa made it crystal clear that whatever moment of understanding we'd shared in Claire's living room didn't magically fix our marriage. She was still ice-cold toward me, still convinced I was a mistake she needed to correct, but at least she wasn't blocking me from seeing Jordan and Lila. Small victories, I guess. I moved into a studio apartment above Murphy's Bar on 3rd Street, the kind of place that came furnished if you counted a mattress on the floor and a card table as furniture. It smelled like beer and regret, but it was mine, and more importantly, it was temporary. A place to figure out what came next, not a place to give up and die. The job hunt was its own special kind of humiliation. Turns out, reliable factory worker for 10 years, doesn't exactly make employers fight over you when half the guys my age have college degrees and the other half have skills that don't involve operating machinery that's probably older than my kids. But I wasn't the same Marcus who'd gotten fired 3 weeks ago. That guy would have gotten discouraged after the 5th rejection, would have started making excuses about the job market, and settled for whatever scraps he could find. The new version of me, the one Agnes had helped wake up, kept knocking on doors. I picked up part-time work wherever I could find it. Delivery driver for Murphy's Pizza, weekend mechanic at Joe's Auto Repair, using the skills my dad had taught me back when I still believed I could fix anything. Construction cleanup crew for a development project across town. None of it paid great, but it paid, and more importantly, it kept me moving forward instead of wallowing in self-pity. "You finally look alive, Marcus," my brother Daniel said when he stopped by my crappy apartment with a six-pack and a worried expression. Beat to hell, but alive. He wasn't wrong. I was exhausted most days, juggling 3 part-time jobs and trying to spend every free moment with my kids. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was actually living instead of just existing. The real reward came in small moments. Jordan asking for my help with his science project instead of just accepting Mom's offer to do it for him. Lila bringing me drawings of our new adventures. Together, stick figures of us at the park, at McDonald's, building blanket forts in my tiny apartment. Slowly, steadily, my children were learning that their father wasn't the kind of man who disappeared when life got complicated. 2 months after that night at the diner, I found myself driving past Mel's 24-hour cafe again. The neon sign was still flickering like it had a nervous condition, and the parking lot still looked like a scene from a movie about people whose lives were falling apart. But this time, I wasn't one of them. I walked in looking for Agnes, wanting to thank the woman who'd saved my life without even knowing it. I wanted to tell her about Jordan's science fair trophy, about Lila's latest artwork covering my apartment fridge, about how I'd finally learned the difference between showing up and actually being present. Dolores was still behind the counter, still looking like she'd been there since the Carter administration, still wielding that ancient coffee pot like a weapon of caffeinated mass destruction. "Excuse me," I said. "A couple months ago, there was an elderly woman here. Agnes. Agnes Hartwell." Dolores frowned, wiping down the same spot on the counter she'd probably been cleaning for decades. "Agnes. You mean Agnes Carter? Honey, she passed away about 4 years ago. Cancer, I think." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood there staring at this woman who'd just casually mentioned that my guardian angel had been dead for years, trying to process what that meant. "You okay, hon?" Dolores asked, because apparently I looked like I'd seen a ghost. Which, I guess, maybe I had. I drove home to my kids in a daze, Agnes's words echoing in my head. Don't abandon them like me. Whether she'd been real or some kind of caffeine-induced hallucination brought on by the worst day of my life, her message had been exactly what I needed to hear when I needed to hear it. Now I understand what my dad meant about standing firm when the world crumbles. It's not about being immovable. It's about knowing what's worth fighting for and refusing to let go of it, no matter how hard life tries to shake you loose. I may have lost a job. I may have lost a marriage. But I found something more important. I found out that Marcus Sullivan is still a father, still a man worth respecting, still someone who shows up when it matters. And that's enough reason to keep standing. While I was in the hospital with a broken leg after a car accident, my wife posted pictures of herself at a party with her ex-boyfriend, captioned, "Finally free from the needy drama king and his constant demands." We'd been together 5 years. I didn't comment. This morning, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating with desperate messages and her mother begging me to reconsider. You know how they say life can change in the blink of an eye? Well, turns out it's more like the screech of tires and the crunch of metal, but hey, close enough. 1 minute I'm cruising home from another soul-crushing day at the office, singing off-key to some pop song on the radio, thinking the biggest drama in my life was whether to order pizza or actually cook something that didn't come from a box. The next minute, I'm getting a very personal introduction to a Mack truck that apparently thought red lights were more like suggestions than actual traffic laws. The whole thing happened so fast it felt like watching someone else's nightmare in slow motion. I was sitting at the intersection of 5th and Main. You know, the one with that sketchy gas station where they sell lottery tickets and questionable hot dogs, waiting for the light to turn green like a law-abiding citizen. Meanwhile, some genius in an 18-wheeler decided physics and traffic signals didn't apply to him. The impact hit my driver's side door with all the subtlety of a freight train meeting a paper airplane. The sound was unreal, like someone had taken a giant tin can and crushed it between their hands. Except the tin can happened to be my Honda Civic, and someone's hands happened to be several tons of Detroit steel. My airbag deployed with the enthusiasm of a jack-in-the-box on steroids, smacking me in the face hard enough to make me see stars that definitely weren't part of the night sky. The steering wheel twisted in my hands like it was made of Play-Doh, and suddenly I was doing this weird spinning dance across 3 lanes of traffic that I definitely hadn't signed up for. Then everything went black, which was honestly a mercy because I'm pretty sure watching my car turn into modern art wouldn't have been great for my mental health. I woke up in St. Mary's Hospital feeling like I'd been run over by a truck, which, technically speaking, I had been. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps, and the smell of antiseptic mixed with whatever they were serving for dinner made my stomach do somersaults. A nurse with scrubs covered in cartoon cats informed me with way too much cheerfulness that I was very lucky to be alive. Lucky, right? Because nothing says winning the lottery like waking up with a leg that looked like it belonged in a Picasso painting and ribs that felt like someone had used them for percussion practice. The damage report read like a grocery list from hell. 1 broken leg, the fancy kind that required surgery and metal hardware. 3 cracked ribs. Apparently, they don't make casts for those. Who knew? And a concussion that made thinking feel like wading through molasses. The leg was the real winner, though, completely shattered in 2 places, requiring enough screws and plates to set off airport security for the rest of my natural life. The doctor, a guy who looked like he should still be asking permission to use the bathroom, explained the whole situation with the kind of professional detachment you'd use to discuss the weather. "You're looking at 8 to 12 weeks of recovery," he said, scribbling notes on his clipboard like he was writing my grocery list. "No weight bearing on that leg for at least 6 weeks. You'll need help with daily activities." Daily activities. Like that wasn't a euphemism for everything from showering to reaching the TV remote without falling face first into the coffee table. The pain medication made everything fuzzy around the edges, like watching life through an Instagram filter designed by someone who'd never actually used Instagram. Every breath felt like someone was driving nails into my chest, and moving my leg was about as pleasant as sticking my hand in a blender. But the physical pain? That was nothing compared to the emotional sucker punch that was about to land. Clara showed up on day 2, sweeping into my hospital room like she was making a grand entrance at some charity gala. She'd clearly put effort into looking the part of the concerned wife. Lipstick perfectly applied, hair styled like she was heading to brunch instead of visiting her husband, who'd nearly become street pizza. She perched on the edge of the uncomfortable plastic chair next to my bed, checking her phone more than she checked on me. "Oh, honey, you look terrible," she said, which really wasn't the greeting I'd been hoping for. These places just give me such anxiety. All the germs and sick people everywhere. She glanced around the room like she expected to catch something fatal just from breathing the air. 20 minutes. That's how long my loving wife of 5 years could stand to stay by my bedside after I'd almost died. 20 minutes before she started making excuses about having somewhere else to be, someone else to see. Something else that was apparently more important than the fact that her husband was held together with surgical tape and good intentions. But Marcus? Marcus was a different story entirely. My best friend since college showed up with a bag of real food. Not the rubber chicken and mystery vegetables they were trying to pass off as meals in this place, and parked himself in that same plastic chair for hours. He helped me figure out how to use the bathroom without falling over. Dignity is apparently optional when you can't put weight on one leg. Brought me books to read when staring at the ceiling got old, and actually listened when I tried to process what had happened. "Dude, you scared the hell out of me," he said, unwrapping what might have been the most beautiful cheeseburger I'd ever seen. "When they called and said you were in an accident, I thought." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The relief in his eyes said everything. That contrast hit me like a second truck. Here was my wife, who supposedly loved me more than anyone else in the world, treating my near-death experience like an inconvenience that was interfering with her social calendar. And here was my friend, dropping everything to make sure I wasn't alone, bringing me actual food because he knew the hospital stuff tasted like cardboard soaked in disappointment. Lying there in that hospital bed, doped up on painkillers and trying to make sense of what had just happened to my life, I started to see things with a clarity that had nothing to do with the medication wearing off. Sometimes it takes a truck running a red light to show you what really matters. Sometimes it takes almost losing everything to realize you might not have had much to lose in the first place. The accident had changed everything, all right, just not in the way I'd expected. Day 3 in paradise. And by paradise, I mean a sterile hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and crushed dreams. I was finally starting to feel human again. Well, human adjacent. The morphine drip had been dialed back enough that I could think in complete sentences, and the swelling around my eyes had gone down to the point where I no longer looked like I'd gone 10 rounds with Mike Tyson's angrier brother. Progress, right? I'd been staring at the water stains on the ceiling tiles for what felt like 17 hours straight, trying to find shapes in them like some kind of twisted Rorschach test. That one looked like a duck. That one looked like my car after it got intimate with a semi-truck. That one looked suspiciously like my will to live, barely there and getting smaller by the minute. Hey, can you hand me my phone? I asked Marcus, who was sprawled in the world's most uncomfortable visitor chair, scrolling through his own device. I should probably check in with work, let them know I'm not just playing hooky in some tropical paradise. Marcus looked up from his screen, and I swear I saw something flicker across his face. Hesitation? Concern? Gas from the hospital cafeteria burrito he'd foolishly consumed an hour earlier? Hard to tell, but he definitely wasn't jumping up to grab my phone from the bedside table. Maybe you should rest a little more, he said, not meeting my eyes. You know, let the brain fog clear up completely before you start dealing with all that stuff. Brain fog. Right. Because apparently getting your skull rattled around like a maraca wasn't great for cognitive function. Who knew? But something about the way he said it, the way he was suddenly very interested in his shoelaces, set off every alarm bell I had left after the accident had knocked most of them loose. Marcus. I used the tone I usually reserved for telemarketers and people who talk during movies. Give me my damn phone. He sighed like I'd asked him to donate a kidney, but he reached over and handed me the device. The screen lit up with a barrage of notifications, missed calls, texts, social media alerts. Normal stuff, except for the weird looks Marcus kept shooting me, like he was watching someone about to step on a landmine. I opened Instagram first because apparently I hate myself and enjoy emotional torture. The app loaded with all the efficiency of a government website, and then boom, there it was, right at the top of my feed like a neon sign advertising my complete and utter humiliation. Clara, my loving, devoted wife, at some swanky rooftop bar I definitely couldn't afford, looking like she'd stepped off the cover of a magazine titled How to Destroy Your Husband's Soul in One Post. She was wearing that little black dress I'd bought her for our anniversary last year, the one that cost more than my monthly car payment. Her arm was draped over some guy's shoulder with the casualness of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. But it wasn't just any guy. Oh no, that would have been too simple, too clean. It was Adrian. Adrian fucking Morrison, her ex-boyfriend from college. The same Adrian she'd sworn up and down was just a friend when he started commenting heart eye emojis on her selfies 6 months ago. The same Adrian she'd gotten defensive about when I'd mentioned maybe it was weird that she texted him at midnight. The same Adrian who apparently had been waiting in the wings like an understudy in the world's most depressing Broadway show. The caption was the real knife twist though. Posted just 2 hours ago, while I was lying here wondering if my leg would ever work properly again. Finally free from the needy drama king and his constant demands. Time to live my life for me. Hashtag no regrets, hashtag fresh start, hashtag living my truth. Needy drama king. Constant demands. I read it 3 times, each time feeling like someone was pouring ice water directly into my bloodstream. 5 years of marriage, and apparently my crime was what? Asking her to contribute to rent occasionally? Expecting her to act like a partner instead of a very expensive house guest? Hoping she might visit her husband in the hospital for more than 20 minutes? The comments were somehow even worse than the post itself. A parade of her girlfriends cheering her on like she'd just won the lottery instead of publicly humiliating her hospitalized husband. Good for you, girl. You deserve so much better. That toxic energy was holding you back. Finally ditching the dead weight. Dead weight. I was literally dead weight. Couldn't even walk without assistance. And they were celebrating like it was some kind of victory. Not one of them, not a single person in that digital peanut gallery, bothered to ask the obvious question. Hey Clara, Isn't your husband currently in the hospital after nearly dying in a car accident? I kept scrolling through the comments like a masochist, each one a fresh paper cut on an already gaping wound. People I'd had over for dinner, people I'd helped move apartments, people whose birthday parties I'd attended with Clara for years. All of them acting like I was some kind of monster she'd heroically escaped from. Dude, Marcus said quietly, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. You should probably put the phone down. But I couldn't stop. It was like watching a car accident in slow motion, except I was both the spectator and the victim. I clicked on Adrian's profile, because apparently I enjoyed pain more than I'd previously realized. His latest post was from the same bar, same night. Him and Clara looking cozy in a corner booth, his hand resting possessively on her thigh. The caption, "Sometimes the best things in life are worth waiting for. Patience pays off. Hashtag second chances, hashtag right person, wrong time." Right person, wrong time. Meaning what? That he'd been waiting for me to almost die so he could swoop in? That my near-death experience was just convenient timing for their romantic reunion? The whole thing was so calculated, so deliberately cruel, that I actually felt impressed by the sheer audacity of it. My chest felt tight, and for a second I wondered if something was wrong with my ribs again. But no, this was different. This was the feeling of 5 years of your life being reduced to a social media celebration, of realizing that the person you'd planned to grow old with had been planning her exit strategy while you were unconscious in the ICU. How long? I asked Marcus, not looking up from the screen. What? How long has this been going on? I gestured weakly at the phone. Don't pretend you don't know. That look on your face when I asked for my phone. You knew. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. I wasn't sure. I mean, I suspected something was off, but how long? He sighed. I saw them together at Starbucks about a month ago. Thought it was weird, but Clara said they were just catching up. Then last week, before your accident, Ginny mentioned seeing Clara's car at his place overnight. A month. A month of lies, of her coming home late with excuses about girls' nights and work events, of her being distant and irritable whenever I tried to be affectionate. A month of planning and scheming while I worked overtime to pay for the life she was already mentally checking out of. The worst part? I wasn't even surprised. Somewhere deep down, in that place where you keep the truths you don't want to acknowledge, I'd known something was wrong. I'd just chosen to believe her lies because facing the truth would have meant admitting that my marriage was as broken as my leg, just less obviously so. I set the phone down on the bedside table with the care of someone handling explosives. My hands were shaking, though whether from anger or shock or the cocktail of medications in my system, I couldn't tell. Well, I said finally, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears, I guess that settles that. The funny thing about betrayal is how it crystallizes everything. 1 minute you're floating through life in this comfortable haze of denial and wishful thinking, and the next minute you're seeing everything with the kind of clarity that would make a telescope jealous. Lying there in that hospital bed, staring at my phone like it had just delivered news of an alien invasion, I felt something shift inside me. Not break. That had already happened when the truck decided to redecorate my car. This was different. This was like a switch flipping, a door slamming shut, a decision being made without me even realizing I was making it. I didn't call Clara, didn't text her, didn't slide into her Instagram DMs with a passive-aggressive comment about her poor timing or questionable life choices. Hell, I didn't even unfriend her on social media, because that would have required acknowledging that what she'd done mattered enough to warrant a response. And here's the thing that probably would have surprised her if she'd bothered to think about it for 5 seconds. It didn't. Not anymore. Instead, I did something that Clara had never been able to handle in all our years together. I got quiet. Real quiet. The kind of quiet that made nurses ask if I was feeling depressed and needed to talk to someone. The kind of quiet that made Marcus bring me extra snacks and hover around my bedside like he was afraid I might do something dramatic. But this wasn't depression or despair or any of the emotional theatrics Clara would have expected from her needy drama king. This was calculation. See, when you're stuck in a hospital bed with nothing but time and a newfangled appreciation for how short life really is, your mind starts working in interesting ways. Mine started doing math. Not the kind they teach you in school, but the kind that matters when you're tallying up the score of a relationship that just revealed itself to be more one-sided than a conversation with a brick wall. Let's start with the big-ticket items, shall we? Rent. Our apartment. Well, my apartment, since only my name was on the lease because Clara's credit score looked like a phone number from the 1800s, cost $1,800 a month. Over the past year, Clara's contributions to that monthly expense totaled a whopping $0. Oh, she'd occasionally throw me $20 for groceries or offer to split a pizza, but actual rent? The thing that kept us from becoming homeless? That was apparently my job and my job alone. Utilities were the same story. Electric bill, gas bill, internet, cable, all of it flowing out of my checking account like I was some kind of one-man charity organization dedicated to keeping Clara comfortable. She justified it by saying she was between jobs or figuring out her career path, or my personal favorite, investing in herself. Investing in herself apparently meant spending her days at yoga studios and coffee shops while I picked up overtime shifts to cover the difference. Then there were the smaller things, the death by 1,000 cuts expenses that you don't really notice until you start paying attention. Her car insurance, because hers had lapsed. Her credit card payments, because she was just behind this month, every month for the past 2 years. The groceries, the dinners out, the little weekend trips she insisted we needed to reconnect, but somehow never had money for. All of it adding up to a very expensive lesson in what it means to carry someone who has no intention of ever returning the favor. But the math wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was remembering all the times I'd defended her to other people. My sister Leah had tried to warn me 6 months ago, sitting in my kitchen and watching Clara order another designer handbag online while complaining about being broke. "She's using you," Leah had said, and I'd gotten defensive, talking about how relationships were about supporting each other and how Clara was going through a tough time finding herself. Finding herself. Jesus. Turns out she'd found herself just fine, wrapped around her ex-boyfriend at some overpriced cocktail lounge, celebrating her freedom from the guy who'd been funding her self-discovery journey. Marcus brought me a burger from that place down the street, the one with the ridiculous portions and the waitresses who called everyone Han. He set it down on the rolling table and gave me a look that suggested he was conducting some kind of mental health assessment. "You've been quiet," he said, settling into the plastic chair that had probably been designed by someone who'd never actually sat in a chair before. "Like, really quiet. It's kind of freaking me out. Just thinking," I said, unwrapping the burger with the care of someone performing surgery. "You know how people always say that when something bad happens, it gives you perspective? Well, turns out they're right. I'm getting all kinds of perspective." "Yeah? What kind of perspective?" I took a bite of the burger, which was exactly the kind of greasy, unpretentious food that Clara would have wrinkled her nose at. She was always trying to get me to eat at those trendy places with names like Farm and Table, where they charged $30 for what amounted to a salad with delusions of grandeur. The kind where you realize you've been playing a game where the other person changed all the rules without telling you, I said. The kind where you figure out that being alone might actually be better than being with someone who sees you as a walking ATM with emotional baggage. Marcus nodded slowly, like he was processing something he'd been thinking about for a while. "So what are you going to do?" That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? What was I going to do? The old me, the me from last week, would have probably tried to save the marriage. Would have called Clara, begged her to come back, promised to change, offered to go to couples therapy, or take salsa dancing lessons, or whatever the hell she thought would fix the problems she'd invented to justify her affair. But that me had been in a car that got turned into abstract art by a Mack truck. This me, the me that was held together with surgical steel and hard-won wisdom, had different ideas. "I'm going to get better," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "And then I'm going to clean house." Clean house. Figure of speech. I'm going to take stock of what's actually mine and what I've been letting other people take credit for. Starting with that apartment that's apparently been financing Clara's journey of self-discovery. The plan wasn't fully formed yet, just a rough outline sketched in the margins of my consciousness while I'd been lying there pretending to watch daytime television. But the foundation was solid. I was done being the guy who paid for everyone else's dreams while mine collected dust in the corner. My sister was going to help. Marcus was going to help. Hell, even Mr. Franklin, my landlord, was going to help. though he didn't know it yet. Because here's what Clara had never bothered to learn about me in 5 years of marriage. I might be quiet, but I'm not stupid. I might be generous, but I'm not a pushover. And I definitely wasn't the needy drama king she'd painted me as on social media. I was just a guy who'd finally realized the difference between being alone and being lonely. And right now, even with a broken leg and a chest full of cracked ribs, I was feeling less lonely than I had in months. 2 weeks later, I was finally sprung from what the hospital staff cheerfully called recovery and what I'd started thinking of as expensive captivity with terrible food. My leg was wrapped in enough hardware to build a small aircraft, and walking required the kind of coordination I hadn't needed since learning to tie my shoes. But I was mobile. Sort of. In the way that a three-legged dog is mobile, determined, slightly pathetic, but getting the job done. Marcus had offered his couch, which was both generous and necessary since going back to my apartment would have meant facing Clara's inevitable return and the awkward conversation that would follow. You know, the one where she'd probably try to gaslight me into believing that celebrating her freedom while I was unconscious in the ICU was somehow my fault for being too emotionally demanding. Hard pass on that particular theater production. But here's the thing about having really good friends and family who've watched you get walked all over for years. Sometimes they're more ready for revenge than you are. I was still in the careful planning stages of my new life strategy when Leah showed up at Marcus's place with a look in her eyes that made me think of generals preparing for battle. "All right, big brother," she said, settling into Marcus's kitchen chair like she was calling a board meeting to order. "We need to talk." Leah had never liked Clara, which I'd always attributed to sisterly protectiveness and maybe a little jealousy. Turns out it was actually just superior judgment and pattern recognition. "Who knew? I've been thinking about your situation," she continued, pulling out her phone and showing me something that made my blood pressure spike. It was Clara's Instagram story from the night before. Her and Adrian at some fancy restaurant, the kind with cloth napkins and servers who introduced themselves by name. She was wearing earrings I'd bought her for Christmas last year, laughing at something he'd said like she didn't have a care in the world. "She's been posting constantly," Leah said, "living it up, spending money she doesn't have, acting like she's some kind of liberated woman who just escaped from prison. Meanwhile, you're here recovering from nearly dying, and she hasn't even bothered to ask how you're doing." Marcus leaned against the counter, nodding along like Leah was preaching gospel. "It's messed up, man. Like, really messed up. So here's what we're going to do," Leah said, and I realized this wasn't a consultation. This was a briefing. "You still have the key to your apartment, right? The one that's in your name, that you've been paying for, that she's been treating like her personal luxury resort." I nodded, though I had a feeling I knew where this was going, and it involved activities that might not be entirely legal, or at least not entirely mature. But then again, mature was overrated, and legal was negotiable when someone had spent the better part of a year financially abusing you while planning their exit strategy. "She doesn't know you're out of the hospital yet," Leah continued. "According to her social media, she thinks you're still laid up for another week. That gives us a window." The plan was elegant in its simplicity and absolutely ruthless in its execution. While Clara was off playing house with Adrian, we were going to help her complete her transition to her new life by removing all traces of her old one. Everything she'd left behind in my apartment, and by everything, Leah meant everything, was going to disappear. But where are we going to put all her stuff? I asked, because even in my newly hardened state, I wasn't quite ready to cross certain lines. "I'm not burning her belongings in the parking lot, no matter how therapeutic that might sound." Leah and Marcus exchanged a look that made me nervous. "We're not going to put it anywhere," Marcus said slowly. "We're going to throw it away. All of it. All of it," Leah confirmed. "Her clothes, her makeup, her shoes, her books, her stupid decorative pillows that served no functional purpose except making the couch uncomfortable. All of it goes in the dumpster behind your building." The idea was so audacious, so completely over the top, that I actually laughed, which hurt my ribs, but it was worth it. Clara, who'd spent years accumulating possessions like she was preparing for a zombie apocalypse at Nordstrom, would come home to find her material world had simply ceased to exist. I paused, trying to find the right word. "That's nuclear." "She went nuclear first," Leah pointed out. "She nuked your marriage while you were unconscious in a hospital bed." This is just returning fire. It took us 3 trips and most of a Saturday afternoon. Marcus brought his pickup truck, Leah brought industrial-strength garbage bags, and I brought a level of vindictive satisfaction I didn't know I was capable of. We started with her closet, which looked like a department store had exploded inside a rainbow. Dresses she'd worn once, shoes that cost more than most people's rent, handbags for every possible occasion, including several I was pretty sure didn't exist. Into the bags it went. The little black dress she'd worn to celebrate her freedom? Gone. The designer heels that had put us behind on the electric bill 3 months ago? History. The collection of handbags that had their own dedicated shelf like they were museum pieces? Now they were making friends with coffee grounds and pizza boxes in the dumpster. Her makeup collection was particularly satisfying to dispose of, mostly because it represented about 6 months' worth of grocery money. Foundation that cost more per ounce than decent whiskey, lipstick in 47 slightly different shades of red, enough eyeshadow to paint a small house. All of it joined the great landfill in the sky. We weren't completely heartless. I kept her important documents, passport, birth certificate, social security card, some family photos that predated our relationship. Those went into a small box that I left with Mr. Franklin at the front desk, along with a note explaining that Clara could pick up her essentials at her convenience. Everything else? Well, everything else was getting acquainted with the waste management system of Greater Metropolitan wherever the hell we lived. The wine fridge was Marcus's idea, and honestly, it was probably the most satisfying part of the whole operation. Clara had insisted we needed a dedicated wine fridge for her collection, which consisted mostly of bottles she'd bought and never opened because she was saving them for special occasions. Apparently, celebrating the end of our marriage while I was in the hospital hadn't qualified as special enough because the thing was still full. Seems like a waste to throw away perfectly good wine, Marcus said, loading bottles into a cooler he'd thoughtfully brought along. You're right, I agreed. We should donate it to a good cause. Like my recovery. By the time we were finished, my apartment looked like a completely different place. Gone were the throw pillows that had served no purpose except making it impossible to actually sit comfortably on my own couch. Gone was the decorative mirror that had cost $300 and reflected nothing but bad decisions. Gone were the scented candles that had made the place smell like a funeral home having an identity crisis. For the first time in years, my apartment looked like it belonged to me. Clean, functional, uncluttered by someone else's need to fill every available surface with stuff that looked expensive and served no purpose. How do you feel? Leah asked, surveying our handiwork with the satisfaction of a general who'd just won a decisive battle. I looked around at what used to be our apartment and was now, definitively and completely mine. Empty hangers swayed gently in the closet like wind chimes celebrating freedom. The bathroom counter, previously invisible under an avalanche of products promising eternal youth and perfect skin, now showed its actual surface for the first time in memory. Lighter, I said, and meant it in every possible way. You know what they say about karma being a bitch? Well, sometimes karma needs a little help from friends in strategic places, and lucky for me, I had exactly the right friend in exactly the right place. 3 days after we'd transformed Clara's material world into landfill fodder, I was sitting in Marcus's living room with my laptop, scrolling through LinkedIn like a man with a mission. Which, technically I was. See, Clara hadn't just been sitting around eating bonbons and planning her escape strategy during our marriage. No, she'd actually been somewhat productive in her scheming. About 2 months ago, she'd started talking excitedly about this amazing opportunity at a boutique marketing firm downtown. Pivot Marketing Solutions, one of those companies with a name that sounded like it was generated by a business buzzword algorithm, but apparently paid well enough to make Clara's eyes light up like slot machines hitting jackpot. The thing was, she hadn't exactly landed this job through her own networking prowess or stunning resume. Clara's work history looked like a game of career hopscotch played by someone who kept forgetting the rules. 6 months here, a year there, always leaving because the boss didn't appreciate her creative vision or the company wasn't aligned with her values. What she had was me, and more specifically, my connection to Dave Martinez. Dave and I had worked together at my previous job for 3 years. He was one of those genuinely decent guys who somehow managed to climb the corporate ladder without stepping on anyone's neck in the process. We'd kept in touch after he moved to a bigger firm, grabbing beers occasionally and commiserating about the weird world of office politics. When he'd mentioned that his new company was looking for someone with Clara's supposed skill set, I'd made the call. "Hey Dave, remember my wife Clara I've told you about? She's looking for something in marketing, and she's really creative." The conversation had been easy, friendly, the kind of favor you do for a buddy because that's what decent people do for each other. Dave had been happy to help, had fast-tracked Clara's resume to the hiring manager, had basically gift-wrapped an opportunity that most people would have killed for. And now, sitting in Marcus's apartment with my laptop warming my good leg and a level of vindictive clarity I was still getting used to, I decided it was time to unwrap that gift and return it to sender. I pulled up Dave's contact info and hit dial, my heart doing that thing where it speeds up just enough to remind you that you're about to burn a bridge. Except this wasn't really burning a bridge. This was more like pointing out that the bridge had been built on quicksand, and maybe everyone should know about it before they tried to cross. "Hey man." Dave's voice was warm and familiar, the sound of someone genuinely happy to hear from you. It almost made me feel guilty. Almost. "How are you feeling? Marcus told me about the accident. That's some scary shit." "Yeah, it's been a ride," I said, settling back into the couch cushions. "But I'm on the mend. Actually, that's kind of why I'm calling. I wanted to talk to you about Clara and that position at your company." "Oh right, the marketing coordinator thing. She starts Monday, actually. Really excited to have her on board. Thanks again for the recommendation, by the way. She interviewed really well." Of course she did. Clara could charm the paint off walls when she wanted something. It was one of her more impressive skills, right up there with spending other people's money and justifying questionable life choices. "About that," I said, pulling up her Instagram on my laptop. "I think there might be some things you should know before she starts. Things that might affect her ability to, actually show up and do the job." Dave's tone shifted slightly, the casual friendliness replaced by something more cautious. "What kind of things?" I started with the social media evidence, because nothing says professional employee like publicly celebrating your husband's hospitalization while you party with your ex. I walked him through the timeline. The accident, the Instagram post, the subsequent parade of celebration photos from someone who was supposedly devastated by her husband's near-death experience. "Jesus," Dave muttered after I'd read him Clara's, finally free from the needy drama king caption. "She posted that while you were in the hospital?" "It's better," I said, clicking through to her more recent posts. This was yesterday. I described the latest photo, Clara and Adrian at some expensive spa in the hills, the kind of place that charged more for a facial than most people made in a week. Her caption was a masterpiece of tone-deaf privilege. "Self-care Sunday with my amazing partner. Life is so much better when you prioritize your own happiness. Hashtag self-love, hashtag new beginnings, hashtag living my best life." "She's posting about her new partner," Dave said slowly. "While she's... Wait, are you guys divorced?" "Nope. Still married. She just decided to upgrade models without bothering to trade in the old one first." There was a long pause, the kind that suggested Dave was reassessing everything he thought he knew about my wife's character, which was exactly what I'd been hoping for. "Look," I continued, "I'm not trying to sabotage her out of spite. Well, maybe a little spite. But mostly I'm trying to save you guys some headaches. You know how she gets when things don't go her way. Remember that story I told you about her quitting her last job because they expected her to actually show up for meetings?" Dave laughed, but it was the uncomfortable kind of laugh people do when they realize they've made a mistake. "Yeah, I remember. You said she was going through a tough time, learning to be more professional, right? Well, turns out the tough time was planning her exit strategy from our marriage while I paid her bills. And the professional development was mostly Instagram tutorials on how to take the perfect breakup selfie." I could hear Dave typing in the background, probably pulling up Clara's social media to see the evidence for himself. The typing got faster, then stopped abruptly. "Holy shit," he said. Is this her at Nobu last night? That place costs like $300 a person. Probably celebrating her new job. The one that starts Monday. The one she got because I vouched for her work ethic and reliability." More typing, more silence, then a long exhale that sounded like someone deflating a balloon. "I have to ask," Dave said finally, "what's her financial situation like? Because we're talking about someone who's going to be handling client budgets, dealing with vendor payments." This was the opening I'd been waiting for. I told him about Clara's credit score, which looked like a phone number from when phones had 4 digits. I told him about the unpaid bills, the maxed-out credit cards, the rent she'd never contributed to despite living in my apartment for over a year. I told him about finding out, through some creative detective work involving her browser history, that she'd been applying for loans using my income information without my knowledge. She's not just unreliable, I concluded. She's actively dishonest about money. And honestly, Dave, I don't think you want someone handling your client's marketing budgets when she can't handle her own finances. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Dave asking increasingly pointed questions about Clara's work history, her reliability, her tendency to disappear when things got difficult. By the end of it, I could hear the decision crystallizing in his voice. I really appreciate you telling me this, he said. I mean, I know this can't be easy, given everything you're dealing with. It's not about easy, I said. It's about not letting someone else get screwed over by the same person who screwed me over. You're a good guy, Dave. Your company deserves better than what Clara is going to bring to the table. After I hung up, I sat in Marcus's living room feeling something I hadn't expected, relief. Not satisfaction, not revenge, just pure relief that I'd finally stopped covering for someone who'd never bothered to cover for me. For 5 years, I'd been making excuses for Clara's behavior, smoothing over her mistakes, vouching for her character when I should have been questioning it myself. My phone buzzed with a text from Dave an hour later. Offer rescinded. Thanks for the heads up. Beers on me next time. Clara's phone started ringing around 5 p.m. I didn't answer, obviously, but I could picture her face when she got the call from HR, the confusion turning to panic as she realized her safety net had just been yanked out from under her. For someone who'd spent years coasting on other people's goodwill and financial support, reality was about to become a very expensive lesson. Margaret Morrison had always been what my grandmother would have politely called a piece of work. In less polite company, she was the kind of mother-in-law who made sitcom writers thank their lucky stars for easy material. Picture a woman who'd never met a problem she couldn't solve by throwing money at it, or a conversation she couldn't dominate with her opinions about everyone else's life choices. She had the kind of confidence that came from never having to face real consequences, the sort of privileged obliviousness that allowed her to give unsolicited advice about marriage while being on husband number 3 herself. For 5 years, Margaret had treated me like I was some kind of charity case that her daughter had graciously taken on. Every family gathering included at least one pointed comment about how lucky I was to be with Clara, how I should be grateful for everything her daughter brought to the relationship. Never mind that what Clara mostly brought was a talent for spending money she didn't have and an impressive collection of reasons why contributing to household expenses was beneath her. Margaret's house in the suburbs was the kind of place that screamed, I peaked in the 80s and refused to acknowledge it. All mauve and gold accents, with enough decorative geese to populate a small lake. She'd made it clear from day one that she considered me a temporary inconvenience in Clara's journey toward finding someone more suitable, which apparently meant someone with a trust fund and a summer house in the Hamptons. So when my phone started ringing at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday with Margaret's contact info lighting up the screen, I knew Clara had finally told her family about our little marital situation. What I didn't expect was for the calls to continue. And continue. And continue. By noon, I'd ignored 17 calls from Margaret Morrison. 17. That's the kind of persistence usually reserved for telemarketers and stalkers, but apparently also for mothers-in-law who'd just discovered their perfect daughter wasn't quite as perfect as advertised. Marcus, who'd been watching this digital harassment with growing amusement, finally looked up from his laptop, where he was pretending to work while actually watching me ignore phone calls like it was performance art. Dude, you're going to have to answer eventually, he said, gesturing at my phone, which had started vibrating again. Call number 18. She's not going to give up. Women like that don't give up. They just get louder. He was right, of course. Margaret Morrison wasn't the type to take a hint, subtle or otherwise. She was the type to show up at your workplace if you didn't return her calls, to corner your friends at the grocery store, to make your life miserable until you paid attention to whatever crisis she decided required your immediate intervention. So when the phone rang for the 19th time, I answered. Hello, Margaret. Oh, thank God, she said, and I was immediately struck by how different she sounded. Gone was the imperious tone I'd grown accustomed to, the voice of someone who was used to being the authority on everything. This voice was shaky, uncertain, almost fragile. "I've been trying to reach you for hours." I noticed. "What's up?" "It's about Clara." She paused, and I could hear her taking one of those deep breaths people take when they're about to say something they really don't want to say. "She came home last night. She's staying in her old room." Her old room. Clara had moved back in with Mommy. The woman who'd been celebrating her independence and freedom from the needy drama king had crawled back to her childhood bedroom like she was 17 again and had just gotten grounded for missing curfew. "Okay," I said, because what else was I supposed to say? "Congratulations. I'm sorry for your loss." She told me about the apartment. Margaret continued, her voice getting smaller with each word. "About her things being gone. About the job. She's very upset. I bet she is. She says you threw away everything she owned. Just threw it all away like it was garbage." "That's not entirely accurate," I said, settling back into Marcus's couch and preparing for what was clearly going to be a longer conversation than I'd hoped. "I kept her important documents. Birth certificate, passport, family photos. Left them with the landlord. Everything else, well, everything else was just stuff she'd accumulated while I paid for her life." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, the kind of silence that suggested she was processing information that didn't match the story she'd been told. "She said you were being vindictive," she said finally, "that you were trying to punish her for finding happiness." "Margaret, did Clara tell you how she announced this happiness to the world?" "What do you mean?" I pulled up Clara's Instagram and read her the caption, word for word. "The finally free from the needy drama king post, complete with timestamp showing it had been posted while I was still unconscious in the ICU after nearly dying in a car accident." The silence that followed was so complete, I actually checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "She posted that while you were in the hospital?" Margaret's voice had gotten very small, very quiet. "Gets better," I said, and told her about the party photos, the celebration posts, the parade of friends congratulating Clara on her escape from the burden of having a husband who expected things like loyalty and basic human decency. More silence. I could practically hear Margaret's worldview reshuffling itself, trying to accommodate information that didn't fit the narrative Clara had been feeding her. "She told me you were unstable," Margaret said slowly, "that you couldn't hold down a job, that you were financially irresponsible. She said the apartment was hers, that she'd been supporting you." "Margaret, I've been working at the same company for 3 years. I've never missed a day of work except when I was unconscious in the hospital. Every bill for that apartment has my name on it because Clara's credit score is somewhere south of dismal. She hasn't paid rent in over a year." I could hear her breathing change, getting faster, more shallow. "The car," she said suddenly. "She said the car you drive was a gift from her. It's a 2018 Honda Civic with my name on the title and my payments coming out of my checking account every month. Clara doesn't even have a license that isn't suspended for unpaid tickets." Oh my God, it was barely a whisper. "Margaret, how much money have you given Clara in the past year?" The pause was long enough to confirm what I'd already suspected. "She said you were in financial trouble," Margaret said, her voice breaking slightly. "She said you'd gotten behind on rent, that you were going to be evicted. She needed money to help you out." "How much?" $8,000. "Over 6 months. $8,000. Clara had been borrowing money from her family under the pretense of helping her financially struggling husband, while said husband worked overtime to cover the bills she refused to help with. It was breathtakingly audacious, even for Clara. "Margaret, I've never been behind on rent. I've never asked Clara for money. I've never even met most of your family because Clara always said they were too busy when I suggested getting together." I could hear her crying now, soft sobs that suggested the full scope of Clara's deception was finally sinking in. For 5 years, Margaret had looked down on me as some kind of deadbeat who was lucky to have her daughter. Turns out, her daughter had been running a con game so elaborate it would have impressed a professional grifter. "I don't understand," Margaret said through her tears. "Why would she lie about all this? Why would she make you sound like the kind of person who deserved to be abandoned while he was in the hospital?" I suggested. "She's my daughter," Margaret said, and her voice was filled with the kind of bewilderment that comes from realizing you don't actually know someone you thought you knew completely. "I raised her. I taught her right from wrong. I don't understand how she became this person. People become who they need to be to get what they want, I said. Clara wanted freedom from responsibility, financial support without strings attached, and sympathy for being the victim of a terrible marriage. So she became the person who could get those things. Margaret was quiet for a long time, processing the wreckage of everything she'd believed about her daughter and her daughter's marriage. What happens now? She asked finally. Now Clara learns what it's like to face consequences for her choices. For the first time in her adult life, probably. She's talking about coming back, Margaret said, trying to work things out with you. She says she made a mistake, that she wants to fix things. I laughed, which probably wasn't the response Margaret was expecting, but it was the only response that made sense. Margaret, Clara doesn't want to fix anything. Clara wants her safety net back. She wants someone to pay her bills and clean up her messes while she figures out her next move. The only mistake she thinks she made was getting caught. So what should I tell her? I thought about it for a moment. About 5 years of being treated like a walking wallet with attachment issues. About waking up in the hospital to find my wife celebrating my accident as her liberation. About all the ways Clara had systematically dismantled my sense of self-worth while building her case for why she deserved better. Tell her good luck, I said finally. And maybe stop giving her money. It's not helping her become a better person. It's just enabling her to avoid growing up. The thing about lies is they're like potato chips. You can never have just one. Each lie requires 3 more lies to support it. And those require 6 more. And pretty soon you're running a full-time fiction factory just to keep your story straight. Clara, it turned out, wasn't just a casual liar. She was a goddamn artist, a Michelangelo of manipulation who'd been painting masterpieces of deception for years while I stood there applauding her creativity. Margaret called me back the next day, and this time her voice had that hollow quality people get when they've spent the night staring at the ceiling, reassessing their entire understanding of reality. She'd clearly been doing some detective work of her own, probably going through old conversations and text messages, connecting dots that should have been obvious but had been camouflaged by years of wanting to believe the best about her daughter. I need to tell you something, she said without preamble, skipping right past the usual pleasantries. About the money. About what Clara told us. I was sitting in Marcus's kitchen, drinking coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead, and scrolling through job listings on my laptop. Recovery was expensive, and sitting around plotting revenge didn't pay the bills, no matter how personally satisfying it might be. I'm listening, I said, because Margaret's tone suggested this was going to be a conversation that required my full attention. She's been borrowing money from all of us, Margaret began, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. Not just me. Her father, her sister, even her grandmother. Different amounts, different stories, but always about helping you out of some financial crisis. I set down my coffee cup harder than I'd intended, the ceramic making a sharp crack against the wooden table. How much are we talking about here, Margaret? From me? 8,000, like I told you. But from everyone combined. She paused, and I could practically hear her doing math in her head. At least $20,000. Maybe more. She told my mother you had gambling debts. She told her father you'd been laid off and were too proud to ask for help. She told her sister you had medical bills from some mysterious chronic condition. $20,000. $20,000 that Clara had borrowed from her family to supposedly help her deadbeat husband, while said deadbeat husband was working 60-hour weeks to keep them afloat financially. It was so audacious, so completely over the top, that I actually felt a grudging admiration for the sheer scope of the operation. But that's not even the worst part, Margaret continued, and I could hear her voice starting to shake with what sounded like a combination of rage and humiliation. The worst part is what she told us about you. About who you were as a person. I'm almost afraid to ask. She said you were emotionally abusive. That you controlled her finances, wouldn't let her have her own bank account, monitored her spending. She said you were jealous and possessive, that you'd threaten to hurt yourself if she ever tried to leave. I sat there in Marcus's kitchen, listening to my mother-in-law describe a version of me that bore absolutely no resemblance to reality, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't just lying about money or making excuses for bad behavior. This was character assassination, a systematic campaign to destroy my reputation and justify whatever Clara wanted to do next. Margaret, I said carefully, have you ever seen me be controlling or abusive toward Clara? In 5 years of knowing me, Have you ever witnessed behavior that would suggest I was the kind of person she was describing? The silence stretched long enough that I could hear Margaret's grandfather clock ticking in the background, marking time while she thought through years of family gatherings and holiday dinners, looking for evidence of the monster Clara had painted me to be. No, she said finally. Never. If anything, you were. She paused again, like she was reluctant to admit what she was thinking. You were too accommodating, too willing to let her have her way. Clara would announce plans without consulting you, spend money on things you clearly couldn't afford, and you just go along with it. Because I thought that's what marriage looked like, I said. I thought supporting your partner meant enabling their dreams, even when those dreams were financially irresponsible and emotionally exhausting. She told us the apartment was hers, Margaret continued, like she was confessing sins in some kind of reverse therapy session. She said she'd been the one paying rent, that your name was on the lease as a favor to you because your credit was bad. She said the car was hers, that she'd bought it and was letting you use it. Each revelation was like discovering another layer of an archaeological dig, except instead of ancient pottery, we were uncovering years of systematic lies designed to make Clara look like a victim and me look like a parasite. It was impressive in its thoroughness and absolutely devastating in its implications. She even showed us pictures, Margaret said, her voice getting smaller. Pictures of the apartment, talking about how she'd decorated it, how she'd picked out the furniture. She made it sound like you were this deadbeat boyfriend who'd moved in and taken over her space. The apartment that Clara had moved into after we got married, because she'd been living with two roommates in a place that looked like it had been decorated by colorblind teenagers with a Home Depot gift card. The furniture she'd picked out had been selected during a single afternoon at IKEA, where she'd pointed at things and I'd loaded them into the cart before paying for them with my credit card. Margaret, does Clara have any documentation for any of these claims? Lease agreements with her name on them? Bank statements showing rent payments? Car loan papers? I know. She said you were handling all the paperwork because she was bad with that kind of thing. Of course she did. Clara had built an entire mythology around being the victim of my financial abuse, while simultaneously being too delicate and overwhelmed to handle basic adult responsibilities like bills and documentation. It was a masterpiece of having your cake and eating it too. She got to be both the strong, independent woman who was supporting her deadbeat husband and the vulnerable victim who couldn't be expected to deal with complicated things like proof. She told us you were unemployed, Margaret continued. That you'd been laid off months ago and were too proud to tell anyone. She said you spent your days playing video games while she worked multiple jobs to keep you afloat. Margaret, you can call my office right now. I've been working there for 3 years. I've never been laid off, never been written up, never missed a day except when I was unconscious in the hospital. I don't even own a gaming console. I could hear her breathing change, becoming more rapid, more shallow. This was the sound of someone's worldview collapsing in real time, of realizing that everything you thought you knew about a situation was not just wrong, but deliberately fabricated. Why would she do this? Margaret asked, and her voice sounded very small and very lost. Why would she lie about everything? Why would she make us hate you? That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? Why had Clara spent 5 years building a case against me to my own in-laws? Why had she systematically poisoned every relationship I might have had with her family, ensuring that I would always be the outsider, the problem, the thing that was holding her back? Because, I said, the answer suddenly crystal clear. She was planning her exit strategy from the beginning. She needed everyone to believe that leaving me was not just justified, but necessary. She needed to be the hero of her own story. And heroes don't abandon their husbands in hospitals unless those husbands are monsters who deserve it. Margaret was crying again, but this time it sounded different. Not the shocked tears from our previous conversation, but something deeper, more broken. The tears of someone who'd been played for a fool and was just beginning to understand the scope of the game. I enabled this, she whispered. I believed every word. I gave her money to help a man I thought was abusing her, and instead I was funding her affair. I looked down on you for 5 years because I thought you were taking advantage of my daughter, and the whole time, your daughter was running a con game so sophisticated that Bernie Madoff would have taken notes. I finished. Margaret, you weren't stupid. You were a loving mother who believed her daughter because that's what loving mothers do. Clara counted on that. She weaponized your love for her against everyone else in her life. What do I do now? Margaret asked. How do I face her? How do I tell the rest of the family that we've all been living in some fantasy world she created? I thought about that for a moment, about 5 years of family gatherings where I'd been treated like an interloper about. Holidays spent feeling like I had to prove my worth to people who'd already been told I was worthless, about all the ways Clara's lies had shaped not just how her family saw me, but how I'd started to see myself. You tell them the truth, I said finally. All of it. And then you stop giving Clara money, stop enabling her lies, and let her face the consequences of the choices she's made. For the first time in her adult life. She's going to be furious, Margaret said. Yeah, I agreed. She probably is. But maybe that's exactly what she needs to be. You'd think that after having her job offer rescinded, her family finally seeing through her web of lies, and discovering that her belongings had become one with the city's waste management system, Clara would have gotten the message. You'd think she might have taken a moment for some self-reflection, maybe considered that her actions had consequences, perhaps even contemplated the radical idea that she'd been in the wrong. You'd be giving Clara way too much credit. Instead, what I got was a masterclass in how not to win back someone you've spectacularly betrayed. It started with the text messages, dozens of them, ranging from angry demands to know what I'd done with her things, to weepy apologies that read like they'd been written by someone who'd learned about emotions from a Hallmark card factory reject pile. Baby, I know you're hurt, but we can work through this. I made a mistake, but everyone deserves a second chance. I love you so much, and I know you love me too. Please don't throw away everything we built together. Everything we built together. Like our relationship had been some kind of collaborative construction project instead of me working double shifts while she figured out new ways to spend money we didn't have. Like she hadn't celebrated my near-death experience as her personal liberation day on social media for the entire world to see. But Clara had always been persistent when she wanted something. And apparently what she wanted now was to convince me that her very public celebration of my hospitalization had been some kind of misunderstanding, a momentary lapse in judgment that could be forgiven and forgotten if I just opened my heart to the possibility of reconciliation. The call started next. I didn't answer them, obviously, because I wasn't a masochist and I'd already heard enough of Clara's creative interpretations of reality to last several lifetimes. But she left voicemails, each one more desperate than the last, ranging from angry accusations about how I was being unfair and vindictive to tearful pleas about how she'd realized her mistakes and wanted to make things right. I know I hurt you. She sobbed into my voicemail on Tuesday afternoon, her voice doing that breathy, little girl thing she'd always used when she wanted something. But I was confused and scared, and I didn't know how to handle seeing you in the hospital like that. I know it looked bad, but Adrian was just a friend helping me through a difficult time. It didn't mean anything. You're the one I love. You're the one I want to spend my life with. Adrian was just a friend. Right. Friends don't usually celebrate your husband's hospitalization by taking you to expensive restaurants and posing for romantic photos that get posted with captions about new beginnings. But Clara had never been particularly concerned with making her lies believable. She just counted on people being too polite or too tired to call her on them. By Thursday, the voicemails had taken on a different tone, more desperate, more unhinged. She'd clearly realized that her usual tactics weren't working, that I wasn't going to be guilt or manipulated into taking her back. The last one was almost incoherent, a rambling monologue about how I was ruining both our lives by being stubborn, how we could have a fresh start if I would just forgive her, how she'd learned from her mistakes and would be a better wife if I gave her another chance. A better wife. The woman who hadn't contributed to rent in over a year, who'd borrowed thousands of dollars from her family while claiming I was financially abusing her, who'd celebrated my accident while I was unconscious in the ICU, was promising to be a better wife. It would have been funny if it wasn't so depressing. But Clara's piece de resistance, her grand gesture of romantic reconciliation, arrived on Friday afternoon in the form of a delivery to Marcus's apartment. I was sitting on his couch, doing physical therapy exercises that were about as fun as they sounded, when his intercom buzzed. Delivery for. The voice paused, apparently trying to decipher some handwriting. For the guy recovering from the car accident? Marcus and I looked at each other with the kind of mutual confusion you get when reality decides to throw you a curveball. He went downstairs and came back 5 minutes later carrying something that made me question whether I was having some kind of medication-induced hallucination. It was a bouquet. Sort of, if you squinted, and had a very generous definition of what constituted floral arrangement. The flowers, and I use that term loosely, were stuffed inside a small garbage can. An actual, honest-to-God trash can, the kind you'd buy at Target for $15 when you were furnishing your first apartment and had no money for anything decent. Dude, Marcus said, holding the thing at arm's length like it might explode. This is either the most insulting gift in human history or your wife has completely lost her mind. Taped to the side of the garbage can was an envelope with my name written in Clara's flowery handwriting. Inside was a card. One of those generic, thinking of you cards you grab at the last minute from the drugstore, with a message that made me wonder if Clara had suffered some kind of head injury that affected her understanding of symbolism and basic human decency. Like trash, our past can be thrown away so something new can grow. She'd written in that same flowery script. Please let's start again. I promise to be the wife you deserve. Love always, Clara. P.S. I know you'll understand the symbolism. The symbolism. Clara thought she was being profound, sending me flowers in a trash can with a note about throwing away the past. Clara, who had literally thrown away our marriage while I was unconscious in a hospital bed, thought a garbage can full of wilted carnations was the perfect metaphor for our fresh start. But wait, it got better. Tucked inside the card, taped to the bottom like some kind of bizarre bonus prize, was a ring. Not our wedding ring. That was apparently still on her finger in all her Instagram photos with Adrian. This was a different ring, a cheap piece of costume jewelry that looked like it had come from one of those mall kiosks that sold genuine diamonds for $19.99 plus tax. Engraved on the inside, in letters so small I had to squint to read them, was a date, July 14th. July 14th. I stared at those numbers for a solid minute, trying to figure out what was significant about that date. It wasn't our anniversary, that was in October. It wasn't our first date, or the day we moved in together, or any other milestone from our relationship. And then it hit me. July 14th was Adrian's birthday. I knew because Clara had made a big deal about it 6 months ago, insisting we had to send him a card because they were such good friends, and she didn't want him to feel forgotten. I thought it was weird at the time, but I'd gone along with it because that's what I did. I went along with Clara's weird requests because I thought that's what love looked like. Clara had sent me a ring with her boyfriend's birthday engraved on it, as a symbol of our fresh start. She'd literally given me jewelry commemorating the man she'd left me for, apparently without realizing what she'd done. I started laughing. I couldn't help it. It was so spectacularly tone-deaf, so completely oblivious, so perfectly Clara, that I couldn't do anything except laugh until my ribs hurt and Marcus started looking at me like I might need medical attention. What's so funny? He asked, taking the ring and holding it up to the light. Check the date. I managed between fits of laughter. Marcus squinted at the engraving, then looked at me with the kind of expression you'd wear if you'd just witnessed someone try to put their shoes on their hands. Is this Adrian's birthday? I confirmed. She gave me a ring with her boyfriend's birthday on it, as a symbol of our new beginning. Marcus stared at the ring for another long moment, then looked at the garbage can full of dying flowers, then back at me. Your wife is completely insane, he said finally. Ex-wife? I corrected, pulling out my phone. Or she will be soon. I took a picture of the whole setup, the trash can, the flowers, the card, the ring, and typed out a text message to Clara. Short, sweet, and to the point. The trash can is exactly where we belong. Then I blocked her number, tossed the ring back into the garbage can where it belonged, and asked Marcus if he wanted to grab dinner somewhere that didn't serve their food in actual trash receptacles. Some grand gestures are romantic. Some are touching. Some make you fall in love all over again. And some make you realize that the person you married is so fundamentally disconnected from reality that they think sending their hospitalized husband a ring commemorating their boyfriend's birthday is the key to winning him back. Clara's grand gesture fell firmly into the last category, and honestly, I couldn't have asked for a better goodbye gift. She'd managed to summarize our entire relationship in one perfectly awful package. Thoughtless, tone-deaf, and completely missing the point. The trash can was exactly where we belonged. The difference was, I was finally ready to take myself out of it. You know what they say about watching a train wreck? You can't look away, even when you know it's going to be ugly. Clara's complete meltdown was like that, except instead of feeling horrified, I felt the kind of satisfied vindication you get when someone who's been cheating at board games finally gets caught and has to face the consequences. The first sign that Clara's world was imploding came through Marcus, who'd been monitoring her social media like it was his job. He'd made himself useful as my personal intelligence gatherer, keeping tabs on Clara's digital breakdown while I focused on more important things like learning to walk without wincing and figuring out what the hell I was going to do with the rest of my life. "Dude," Marcus said, bursting into his own living room like he'd just discovered fire. "You need to see this." He shoved his phone in my face, Clara's Instagram story filling the screen. Gone were the carefully curated photos of expensive dinners and romantic moments with Adrian. Instead, there was a blurry, shaky video of Clara sitting in what looked like her childhood bedroom, mascara streaking down her face like some kind of Halloween makeup gone wrong. "This is what happens when you try to destroy someone's life out of spite," she was saying to the camera, her voice thick with tears and what sounded like a fair amount of wine. "When you're so bitter and vindictive that you can't stand to see your ex-wife happy. Some people are just toxic, and you have to protect yourself from their negative energy." Toxic. Clara, who'd celebrated my hospitalization on social media while borrowing money from her family under false pretenses, was calling me toxic for refusing to take her back after her grand gesture with the garbage can flowers. "It gets better," Marcus said, swiping to the next story. This one was a screenshot of a text conversation, presumably between Clara and Adrian, though she'd been smart enough to blur out his contact info. What wasn't blurred was his message. "I think we should take a break. This whole situation is too messy for me right now." Adrian was bailing. Prince Charming had apparently decided that dating someone whose life was falling apart in real time wasn't as appealing as he'd thought it would be. Shocking, really, that a guy who'd been willing to hook up with a married woman might not be the most stand-up character when things got complicated. The stories kept coming over the next few days, each one more unhinged than the last. Clara ranting about unfair treatment, about people not understanding her side of the story, about how she was the real victim in all of this. She posted motivational quotes about overcoming adversity that were clearly meant to paint her as some kind of warrior battling against injustice, rather than someone facing the consequences of her own spectacularly bad decisions. But the social media meltdown was just the opening act. The main event came when Clara decided to crowdsource her recovery. "Holy shit," Marcus said, reading from his laptop screen. "She started a GoFundMe." I was doing physical therapy exercises on his living room floor, trying to rebuild the muscle strength in my leg, while simultaneously rebuilding my entire life, when he delivered this latest update on Clara's descent into madness. "What's it for?" I asked, though I had a feeling I already knew. "Husband threw me out, stole my money," Marcus read, his voice taking on the dramatic tone people use when they're reading particularly ridiculous news headlines. "Help me get back on my feet after financial abuse." Financial abuse. Clara had started a crowdfunding campaign, claiming I'd financially abused her. The woman who hadn't paid rent in over a year, who'd borrowed thousands from her family while claiming I was a deadbeat, who'd celebrated my hospitalization while planning her escape to a more expensive lifestyle with her ex-boyfriend, was asking strangers on the internet to donate money because I'd supposedly stolen from her. The campaign description was a masterpiece of creative writing, painting Clara as a brave survivor who'd finally escaped from an abusive marriage only to discover that her evil husband had destroyed all her belongings and emptied their joint accounts out of spite. Never mind that we'd never had joint accounts because Clara's credit was so bad that banks wouldn't let her have a checking account without a cosigner. "She's asking for $15,000, Marcus continued, scrolling through the page. "Says she needs money for a security deposit on a new apartment, basic necessities, and therapy to recover from the trauma I put her through." Therapy to recover from trauma. Clara needed therapy, all right, but not for the reasons she was advertising to potential donors. "How much has she raised?" I asked, genuinely curious to see if anyone was buying this particular brand of fiction. $63, Marcus said, grinning. "From 2 donors. One of them left a comment asking for proof of the abuse allegations. $63. Out of a $15,000 goal. Apparently, even strangers on the internet could smell bullshit when it was laid on this thick. But Clara's online presence wasn't the only thing falling apart. According to Margaret, who'd been keeping me updated on the family drama with the dedication of someone who discovered she'd been living in a soap opera for years, Clara's real-world situation was deteriorating just as spectacularly. She tried to get into the apartment, Margaret told me during one of our increasingly frequent phone calls. Mr. Franklin called the police. Clara had apparently shown up at my building at 3 in the morning, drunk and demanding that the landlord let her into her apartment. When Mr. Franklin had politely explained that her name wasn't on the lease and she had no legal right to be there, she'd started screaming about theft and abuse loud enough to wake half the building. The police ran her information, Margaret continued, her voice tight with embarrassment. She had unpaid tickets, a lot of them, and apparently there was a warrant for missing a court date about driving with a suspended license. Clara had been arrested. Right there in the lobby of my apartment building, in front of half the tenants and probably at least one person with a smartphone who was definitely going to post about it on social media. The woman who'd been so concerned with her public image that she'd crafted an entire false narrative about our marriage had been hauled away in handcuffs for unpaid parking tickets and driving violations. Her father won't bail her out, Margaret added. Neither will her sister. They're all still processing everything you told me about the money she borrowed. Clara was sitting in county lockup because she'd blown through her family's goodwill as thoroughly as she'd blown through their money. The people who'd spent years enabling her behavior, making excuses for her choices, and funding her lifestyle had finally reached their limit. What about Adrian? I asked, because I was genuinely curious whether Prince Charming would step up now that his lady love was experiencing some genuine adversity. Margaret's laugh was bitter. He blocked her on everything. Social media, phone, email. Apparently, dating a married woman is exciting right up until she gets arrested for stalking her ex-husband. The GoFundMe got reported and taken down within 48 hours. Too many people had flagged it as fraudulent, probably after doing the kind of basic fact-checking that Clara had been counting on nobody bothering with. Her social media accounts went quiet after that, presumably because it's hard to maintain your online presence when you're dealing with court dates and trying to figure out how to pay for a lawyer with $63 in crowd-funded sympathy money. But the silence didn't last long. A week later, Clara was back online with a vengeance, posting increasingly desperate and unhinged content about injustice and persecution. She'd apparently decided that the best way to handle her situation was to double down on the victim narrative, posting long, rambling captions about how society failed women who tried to escape abusive relationships. Her friends started distancing themselves. The same people who'd commented, "Good for you, girl," on her original celebration post were noticeably absent from her recent content. Turns out, supporting someone's empowerment journey is a lot more appealing when it doesn't involve felony charges and public meltdowns. She called me last night, Margaret said during our latest update call, crying, begging me to help her. She said she'd learned her lesson, that she was ready to change, that she just needed one more chance to get her life together. What did you tell her? I told her that learning lessons involves facing consequences, not finding new ways to avoid them. I told her that if she wants to get her life together, she needs to do it without other people's money and other people's excuses. Margaret had finally found her backbone, and Clara was discovering what life looked like when you couldn't manipulate the people around you into cleaning up your messes. It was ugly, messy, and entirely self-inflicted, but it was also completely deserved. Clara's world hadn't just collapsed. It had imploded with the spectacular efficiency of a building demolished by professionals. Job gone, boyfriend gone, family support gone, public reputation destroyed, and facing legal consequences for the first time in her adult life. And the best part? I hadn't had to do anything except stop enabling her. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply step back and let someone face the natural consequences of their choices without trying to save them from themselves. Clara had spent years building a house of cards made from lies, manipulation, and other people's money. All it had taken was one strong wind to bring the whole thing crashing down. 6 months later, I was sitting on the balcony of my new apartment, watering the herb garden I'd finally had space to plant. Basil, rosemary, thyme, simple things that grew when you actually took care of them. My leg had healed better than expected, and I'd named my used Honda Liberty because apparently near-death experiences make you sentimental about independence. Therapy had been worth every penny. Turns out, staying with someone because you're afraid of being alone isn't love. It's codependency with better marketing. I'd spent 5 years trying to fix Clara when I should have been asking why I thought broken people were my responsibility. Margaret had surprised me with a final visit, bringing a check for $2,000. "I'm sorry," she'd said simply. I enabled her behavior by always bailing her out. "This is for your fresh start." Her daughter was working at a diner now, living in a studio apartment, still convinced the world owed her better. I didn't feel vindictive anymore. I felt free. Clara had taught me exactly what I didn't want in a partner, and for that lesson, expensive as it was, I was almost grateful. Almost. Liberty purred to life as I headed to work, windows down, no one to answer to but myself. Sometimes the best revenge is just living well.